Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. There are moments in life when everything changes. A phone call that never comes. A door that stays closed. A smile that becomes a memory frozen in time. Most violent crimes don't erupt from nowhere like sudden storms. They build slowly, quietly, in the spaces between words, in glances that linger too long, in hands that grip just a little too tight. They whisper warnings that go unheard until it's too late. Tonight, we're going to examine 9 lives that intersected with darkness. 9 people who walked into situations that seemed ordinary until they weren't. These aren't just cases. They're mirrors reflecting patterns we see again and again. Jealousy that curdles into obsession, love that twists into control, and warnings that echo in empty rooms where someone should have been listening. The question that haunts every single one of these stories isn't just who or how. It's why didn't anyone stop this? Why were the signs dismissed? Why did systems designed to protect people fail so completely? By the time you reach the end of this journey, you'll understand that these weren't mysteries. They were preventable tragedies. Our first story begins on a night that should have been about celebration, about youth and possibility, and the kind of freedom that comes with being 23 and feeling invincible. Isabella Cruz Navarro had every reason to feel that way. She was the first person in her entire family to attend university, carrying the hopes and dreams of parents who had worked 2 jobs each to give their daughter opportunities they never had. Isabella studied environmental science with a focus that impressed her professors. She volunteered at community gardens on weekends. She called her mother every single day, without fail. That weekend in Harbor City started like countless others for young people looking to blow off steam after midterm exams. Isabella and 3 friends drove 2 hours from their college town, planning to hit the clubs in the entertainment district, dance until their feet hurt, and drive back Sunday afternoon with stories to laugh about for weeks. They checked into a budget hotel, changed into their best outfits, and headed out as the sun was setting over the Pacific. The first club was too crowded. The second had a cover charge that made them roll their eyes. By the third venue, they were tipsy on cheap wine and the kind of giddy energy that comes from being young and away from responsibilities. That's where Isabella met Marco Reyes. He was playing guitar in the corner with 2 other musicians, his fingers moving across strings with practiced ease, his voice rough in a way that made certain songs feel more authentic. During their break, he approached Isabella at the bar. Their friends would later describe the interaction as normal. Marco complimented her earrings. Isabella laughed at something he said. They talked for maybe 15 minutes before the band started playing again. When the club closed at 2 in the morning, Isabella told her friends she was going to hang out with Marco a little longer. He mentioned an after-party. She promised to be back at the hotel by sunrise. Her friends hesitated. They'd been drinking. They were tired. Isabella was 23, not a child. She showed them Marco's social media profile on her phone. See, he's a real person. He plays music all over the city. I'll be fine. One friend asked if she wanted company. Isabella said no, told them to get some sleep, and walked out into the night with a man she'd known for less than 3 hours. Surveillance cameras captured them getting into Marco's car at 2:17 in the morning. Isabella was smiling. She got in willingly, without hesitation. The footage shows Marco opening the passenger door for her, a gesture that seemed polite, even charming. They drove away heading north, away from the hotel district, toward a residential neighborhood where street lights grew sparse and houses sat back from the road behind overgrown hedges. Marco lived in a converted warehouse that had been split into cheap apartments. But he didn't live alone. He shared the space with 2 women, Lena Hart and Rosa Quinn, who presented themselves to outsiders as married partners running a small art studio. The reality inside those walls was more complicated, a tangled web of relationships that none of them fully understood or were willing to acknowledge. Marco had been involved with Lena for over a year, a fact that Rosa either didn't know or chose to ignore. Lena had married Rosa for immigration purposes, a transaction that had slowly transformed into genuine affection, though neither woman seemed willing to examine what that meant. Marco moved in 6 months before Isabella arrived, inserting himself into their dynamic in ways that created tension none of them could articulate. Jealousy lived in that apartment like a fourth roommate, silent and watchful. When Marco brought Isabella home that night, Lena was awake, painting in the studio space. Rosa was asleep in the bedroom they all theoretically shared, though the sleeping arrangements shifted based on moods and arguments and who was angry at whom. Marco introduced Isabella as a friend, someone who wanted to see his music setup. Lena looked at this young, beautiful woman with her whole life ahead of her, and something cold settled in her chest. Isabella didn't sense danger. Why would she? Marco made coffee. Lena showed her some paintings. They talked about art and music and the suffocating feeling of trying to make it in a city that chewed up dreams and spat out rent payments. Rosa woke up around 4 and joined them, sleepy-eyed and curious about their guest. To anyone watching from outside, it would have looked like 4 young people enjoying an impromptu gathering. But underneath the surface, dynamics were shifting. Marco kept touching Isabella's arm when he talked. Lena's jaw grew tighter with each casual contact. Rosa noticed Lena's mood darkening and tried to compensate by being extra friendly to Isabella, which only made Lena more upset. The air in the apartment thickened with unspoken tensions. Around 5 in the morning, Isabella said she should get back to her hotel. Her friends would worry. Marco offered to drive her. Lena said no, it was too far. Isabella should just stay until it was properly light out, safer that way. The suggestion sounded reasonable. Isabella agreed, settling onto the couch with a blanket. She sent a text to her friends saying she'd be back by 8. That message was the last communication anyone outside that apartment received from her. What happened in the next 3 hours would later be pieced together from forensic evidence, inconsistent testimonies, and the kind of psychological analysis that tries to make sense of senseless violence. The exact sequence of events remained disputed, but certain facts were indisputable. At some point, the mood shifted from friendly to hostile. Someone said something. Someone reacted. The situation escalated with terrifying speed. Isabella tried to leave. Marco blocked the door. She raised her voice, demanding to be let out. Lena told her to shut up, worried about neighbors hearing. Rosa stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Isabella reached for her phone to call for help. Marco grabbed it from her hand. She screamed. Someone hit her to make her stop. And then the violence became unstoppable, feeding on itself, fueled by panic and rage, and the terrible momentum of actions that cannot be taken back. The details are difficult to recount, not because they're unknown, but because they're almost unbearable. Isabella fought. The forensic evidence made that clear. She fought hard, desperately, trying to survive. But she was one person against 3, in an unfamiliar space, probably still impaired from drinking hours earlier. The apartment's walls were thick. No one heard her screaming. When it was over, when Isabella Cruz Navarro lay still on the floor of that converted warehouse, 3 people stood looking at what they had done. The woman who had called her mother every single day would never make another call. The first person in her family to attend university would never finish her degree. The young woman who smiled at a musician in a nightclub would never smile again. What they did next revealed the depths of their depravity. Rather than call for help, rather than face what they'd done, they tried to hide it. They cleaned. They moved her body. They created a story. And in doing so, they transformed from people who had committed a terrible act in a moment of chaos into people who chose, deliberately and with calculation, to cover up a murder. The hours after Isabella's death were marked by a cold pragmatism that chilled investigators when they later reconstructed the timeline. Marco, Lena, and Rosa didn't panic in the way that ordinary people might when confronted with the enormity of what they'd done. Instead, they moved with purpose, making decisions that suggested they were more concerned with avoiding consequences than with the life they'd just ended. They wrapped Isabella's body in a tarp from the art studio. They loaded it into Marco's car while Harbor City slept, unaware that a young woman's future was being erased just blocks from the clubs where people were still dancing. They drove to a rural area 40 minutes outside the city, to a place Marco knew from childhood camping trips, and they left her there among the trees like she was garbage to be disposed of. Back at the apartment, they scrubbed. Bleach burned their hands. They threw away rugs and pillows. They broke Isabella's phone and tossed it in a dumpster 3 neighborhoods over. By the time the sun rose on what should have been Isabella's last morning in Harbor City before driving back to school with her friends, the apartment looked normal. No blood. No evidence. No indication that anything unusual had happened. Isabella's friends started calling her at 8 when she didn't return to the hotel. The calls went straight to voicemail. They waited, assuming she'd overslept, that her phone had died, that she'd show up with an embarrassed grin and a story about losing track of time. By noon, they were worried. By 2, when checkout time forced them to make a decision, they were terrified. They filed a missing person report before driving back to campus, leaving behind a city that had swallowed their friend whole. The investigation moved slowly at first. Isabella was an adult who'd left a club voluntarily with someone. The initial assumption, never stated outright but implicit in how resources were allocated, was that she'd made a poor choice and would turn up embarrassed but safe. Her family's frantic calls were met with reassurances that most missing persons came home on their own within 48 hours. Just wait. Be patient. She'll call. But Isabella's mother knew something was wrong. Mothers always know. Her daughter called every day. Every single day, without exception for 4 years. The absence of that call was as loud as a scream. She drove to Harbor City, organized search parties, plastered the entertainment district with flyers showing Isabella's face. She went to the last club herself, showed the photo to anyone who would look, and that's how she found the band that had been playing that night. Marco was gone. His bandmate said he'd texted them saying he was leaving town for a while. Family emergency, he'd be in touch. The timing struck Isabella's mother as strange. She went to the police with this information. They nodded, took notes, said they'd look into it. Days passed, then a week, then 2. Marco, Lena, and Rosa had fled in 3 different directions, a plan they'd apparently coordinated in those terrible hours after disposing of Isabella's body. Marco headed to Mexico, where he had distant relatives. Lena went to Canada, using her marriage to Rosa to cross the border legally. Rosa disappeared into the sprawling network of activist communities on the West Coast, places where asking too many questions about someone's past was considered rude. It might have worked. They might have gotten away with it forever if not for 2 things. First, Marco couldn't help himself from maintaining some form of online presence, posting guitar videos from unnamed locations, staying connected to the music scene that gave his life meaning. Second, a hiker found Isabella's body 3 months after her disappearance. The discovery happened on a Tuesday morning. A man walking his dog in the woods noticed buzzards circling. He investigated, despite the smell that grew stronger with each step. What he found sent him stumbling backward, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. The decomposition was advanced, but certain things remained intact enough for identification. Jewelry that Isabella never took off. Dental records that matched. DNA that confirmed what her mother had known in her heart since that first missed phone call. The forensic examination revealed the violence of her final moments. Investigators documented every injury, every defensive wound, building a picture of desperate struggle and overwhelming force. They found trace evidence that would later tie all 3 suspects to the crime. Fibers that matched the tarp she'd been wrapped in, DNA under her fingernails from when she'd fought back, microscopic particles that told stories the killers thought they'd erased with bleach. The case exploded into national news. The contrast between Isabella's smiling college photos and the grim reality of how she died created the kind of narrative that gripped public attention. Harbor City police faced intense criticism for their initial response, for treating a young Latina woman's disappearance as less urgent than it deserved to be. The pressure forced them to dedicate serious resources to finding her killers. Marco was arrested first, picked up at a hostel in Tijuana where he'd been paying cash and using a fake name. Mexican authorities cooperated fully with extradition requests, and within 2 weeks, he was sitting in an interrogation room in Harbor City, looking at photographs of Isabella and being asked to explain why her DNA was all over his apartment and his car. He claimed innocence at first, saying Isabella had visited briefly and left safely. When confronted with evidence that she'd never left the apartment alive, he blamed Lena, painting a picture of a jealous woman who'd attacked Isabella in a rage while he tried to intervene. It was a calculated move, trying to shift blame to someone who wasn't yet in custody, someone who couldn't defend herself against his narrative. Lena was found 3 weeks later in Vancouver, working under the table at a vegan restaurant and living in a house with 6 other people who knew her only as an American seeking refuge from capitalism. When Canadian police showed up, she was sitting in the communal kitchen drinking tea and discussing the patriarchy. They arrested her mid-sentence. Her story contradicted Marco's in significant ways. She admitted being present when Isabella died, but claimed it was Marco who'd initiated the violence. Marco who'd prevented Isabella from leaving. Marco who'd convinced both women to help cover it up by threatening to tell police they'd been the aggressors. She cried during her interrogation, real tears that investigators couldn't quite determine were from remorse or fear of consequences. Rosa took the longest to locate, finally found in Portland at a protest against police violence, which had a dark irony that wasn't lost on the detectives who recognized her face from the warrant. She immediately asked for a lawyer and said nothing, not a single word, during hours of questioning. Her silence was interpreted as calculation, as consciousness of guilt, as evidence that she knew exactly how bad this was. When all three were finally in custody, the district attorney faced a complicated decision about charges. The physical evidence proved all three had participated in covering up the crime, but determining who had struck the blows that killed Isabella, who had held her down, who had been the primary aggressor required parsing testimonies that contradicted each other in convenient ways. They were all charged with murder, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence. The trials were separated, a tactical decision that allowed prosecutors to use each defendant's testimony against the others. Marco went first. His defense attorney tried to portray him as a musician caught up in a toxic relationship dynamic, someone who'd made terrible choices while under psychological duress from the women he lived with. The jury didn't buy it. They convicted him on all counts. Lena's trial focused heavily on the forensic evidence, placing her at the scene and her own admissions during interrogation. Her defense tried to paint her as a victim of Marco's manipulation, an immigrant woman trapped in an abusive situation who'd feared for her own life. The prosecution countered with evidence of her active participation in disposing of the body and cleaning the crime scene. She was convicted as well, though on slightly lesser charges. Rosa's trial came last, and by then the public narrative had already solidified around certain assumptions about who had done what. Her continued silence, which her lawyer framed as exercising constitutional rights, was perceived by many as arrogance. The prosecution used testimony from both Marco and Lena, each pointing fingers at Rosa as being more involved than she'd admit. Without her own voice in her defense beyond the lawyer's arguments, the jury had little to counterbalance these accusations. She was convicted on all counts. Sentencing revealed disparities that sparked outrage among advocates who'd been following the case. Marco received life without parole, the harshest sentence possible. Lena got 35 years with possibility of parole after 25. Rosa received 40 years with parole eligibility after 30. The differences were attributed to varying degrees of culpability as determined by the evidence and testimonies. But critics pointed out the racial and gender dynamics at play, how the brown-skinned man received the harshest punishment while the white woman got the most lenient sentence despite all three being present when Isabella died. Isabella's mother attended every day of every trial, sitting in the front row where the defendants couldn't avoid seeing her face. She never shouted or made scenes. Her presence was statement enough, a living reminder of what they'd taken from the world. When she finally stood to give her victim impact statement before sentencing, she spoke for 20 minutes without notes, describing her daughter's childhood, her dreams, her daily phone calls that would never come again. The courtroom was silent except for her voice and the sound of people trying not to cry too loudly. She didn't ask for harsh sentences or express hatred for the people who'd killed her child. She simply said that Isabella had trusted the wrong person on the wrong night, and that trust had been betrayed in the worst possible way. She ended by looking directly at each defendant and saying that she hoped they would eventually tell the complete truth about what happened, that Isabella deserved that much at least. None of them ever did. In the years since their convictions, Marco has given interviews claiming his innocence, saying he's taking the fall for the women. Lena has apologized publicly but still maintains she tried to stop the violence rather than participate in it. Rosa has never spoken about the case at all, remaining silent even when offered reduced sentences in exchange for full disclosure. The complete truth of those 3 hours in that apartment died with Isabella. The case changed Harbor City's approach to missing person reports, implementing new protocols that treated all disappearances as urgent regardless of the circumstances. It's a small reform born from enormous loss, The kind of change that comes too late to save the person whose suffering forced the issue. Isabella's family established a scholarship in her name for first-generation college students studying environmental science. Every year, a young person gets to pursue the dreams Isabella never completed. But policy changes and scholarships don't bring back the dead. They don't restore the daughter who called her mother every day. They don't fill the empty chair at family gatherings. They're band-aids on wounds that never fully heal, attempts to create meaning from tragedies that remain fundamentally meaningless. The jealousy that killed Isabella Cruz Navarro wasn't special or unique. It's the same jealousy that poisons relationships every day, the same territorial possessiveness that treats people like property, the same inability to accept that attention given to someone else isn't attention stolen from you. In most cases, it doesn't end in murder. It ends in arguments and breakups and damaged relationships. But sometimes, when the wrong people feed that jealousy in the wrong environment without the wrong safeguards, it becomes lethal. Marco, Lena, and Rosa weren't monsters from birth. They were ordinary people who made choices, small choices at first that seemed reasonable in the moment, and then larger choices that cascaded into the irreversible. They chose to bring Isabella to that apartment. They chose to let tensions escalate rather than de-escalate. They chose violence over de-escalation. They chose cover-up over accountability. Each choice made the next one easier, building momentum toward an ending none of them could have predicted when the night began. Isabella never got to make those choices. She chose to trust someone who seemed nice. She chose to go to a party. She chose to believe that people were fundamentally good. Those choices shouldn't have been fatal. In a better world, they wouldn't have been. But we don't live in that world. We live in this one, where young women are killed for the crime of being visible, being attractive, being in the wrong place with people who can't handle their own emotions. The warning signs were there. Marco had a history of intense, short-lived relationships that ended badly. Lena had been in therapy for jealousy and control issues. Rosa had distanced herself from family who'd expressed concerns about her living situation. But warning signs only matter if someone is watching for them, if systems exist to intervene before tragedy strikes. In this case, no such systems were in place. Isabella walked into that apartment unaware that she was stepping into a pressure cooker of unresolved tensions that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with people who hadn't dealt with their own demons. Her story ends in those woods where a hiker found what was left of a vibrant young woman who'd wanted to save the environment. Their stories continue in prison cells where 3 people wake up every day knowing they destroyed not just Isabella's life, but their own, their families, everyone connected to this senseless act of violence. There are no winners here, only varying degrees of loss. The transition from Isabella's case to the next one is jarring because it has to be. These stories don't flow naturally into each other. They're separate tragedies united only by patterns we'd rather not see, by warnings we'd rather not hear, by uncomfortable truths about violence and gender, and the value we place on certain lives over others. Jealousy doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes it festers in private, behind closed doors, in homes where outsiders see only the facade of normalcy. The next story takes us behind one of those doors, into a marriage that looked fine from the street, but was rotting from within, into a pattern of violence that escalated over years until it reached its inevitable, terrible conclusion. Emily Rowe was 41 years old when she died. She'd been married to Daniel Rowe for 18 years, together since she was 21 and he was 25. They had 3 children, ages 16, 13, and 9. From the outside, they looked like any other middle-class family in Eastbrook, a quiet northeastern city where people knew their neighbors and kids rode bikes in the street without fear. But inside their house, Emily lived in a state of constant alert, reading her husband's moods like a weather forecast, trying to predict and prevent the storms that came with increasing frequency and intensity. The violence had started small, as it always does. A raised voice, a slammed door, anger that seemed disproportionate to whatever minor issue had triggered it. Emily made excuses, to herself and others. Everyone fights sometimes. Marriage is work. He's under stress at his job. He's not really like this. Except he was like this. And he was getting worse. The first time Daniel shoved her was during an argument about money when their oldest was 3. He immediately apologized, cried, swore it would never happen again. Emily believed him because she wanted to believe him, because she had a toddler and a mortgage and a life she'd built around the assumption that her husband was a good man having a bad moment. The second incident came 6 months later, then 4 months after that, then monthly, then weekly. The timeline of escalation followed a predictable pattern that domestic violence experts could chart like a graph. Each spike in violence lowering the threshold for the next one, each apology becoming less sincere, each promise to change becoming more hollow. Emily started wearing long sleeves in summer. She got good at applying makeup to cover bruises. She learned which topics to avoid, which tone of voice to use, how to navigate conversations in ways that minimized the chance of setting him off. She became hyper-vigilant, reading micro-expressions and body language, developing the kind of survival skills that would be impressive if they weren't so desperately sad. Her friends noticed changes. Emily, who'd been social and outgoing, stopped accepting invitations to gatherings. She made excuses. The kids have activities. Daniel needs quiet time. I'm just tired. When friends persisted, showing up at her door with concern in their eyes, she smiled and insisted everything was fine. Really, just busy with family stuff. The isolation wasn't accidental. Daniel had been systematically cutting her off from support systems, criticizing her friends, making social interactions so difficult that staying home seemed easier. The children grew up in this environment, absorbing the tension like it was normal, learning to read their father's moods just as carefully as their mother did. The oldest, Sarah, started having panic attacks at 13. The middle child, Ben, became withdrawn, spending hours in his room with headphones on to drown out the sounds of arguments. The youngest, Emma, clung to Emily with desperate intensity, as if afraid her mother might disappear. Emily tried to leave twice. The first time was after Daniel broke her wrist during an argument about Sarah's report card. She packed bags for herself and the kids, called a women's shelter, and was about to walk out the door when Daniel broke down completely, sobbing, begging, promising therapy, promising change, promising everything she'd ever wanted to hear. He even went to a few counseling sessions, enough to convince Emily he was serious. Then he stopped going. The wrist healed. The pattern resumed. The second attempt came 3 years later. Emily had been secretly saving money, hiding small amounts of cash in a book on her shelf. She'd researched divorce lawyers, made copies of financial documents, planned her exit with the kind of careful strategy that war generals would admire. But Daniel found the hidden money. The explosion of rage that followed left Emily hospitalized with cracked ribs and a concussion. She told the emergency room staff she'd fallen downstairs. They didn't believe her, but without her cooperation, there was nothing they could do. That hospital visit triggered a mandatory report to police, who showed up at Emily's door 3 days later to ask questions. She spoke to them on the porch, never inviting them inside where Daniel lurked with his jaw clenched and his hands in fists. She assured the officers everything was fine. She'd been clumsy. Her husband would never hurt her. They left, adding another report to a file that was growing thicker but leading nowhere. Emily's friends staged an intervention of sorts, gathering at a coffee shop and confronting her with their concerns. They'd seen the bruises. They'd noticed the fear in her eyes. They wanted to help. Emily cried and admitted things weren't good, but she couldn't leave. Where would she go with 3 kids? How would she support them? Daniel controlled all their finances. She had no job skills after being a stay-at-home mother for 18 years. It was too complicated. She'd figure it out. Just give her time. Time was the one thing Emily didn't have, though she didn't know it yet. Daniel's violence was escalating toward an endpoint that felt inevitable in hindsight, but was impossible to see clearly when you're living inside the chaos. Every expert on domestic violence knows that the most dangerous time for a victim is when they try to leave, when the abuser's control is threatened, when desperation and rage collide into something explosive. Emily finally decided to leave permanently after Daniel threatened their children directly for the first time. He'd been angry at Ben for something trivial, and when Emily intervened, Daniel turned on her with such fury that all 3 kids witnessed the assault. Sarah called 911. Police arrived to find Emily bleeding and Daniel locked in the bathroom, screaming that it was his house, and they had no right to be there. This time, Emily pressed charges. She obtained a restraining order. She stayed with her sister in a town 30 minutes away, bringing the kids and whatever belongings they could grab quickly. The legal system moved slowly, setting court dates and processing paperwork, while Emily tried to build a new life from scratch. She enrolled in online classes to update her skills. She applied for jobs. She met with lawyers to discuss divorce proceedings. Daniel was ordered to stay at least 500 feet from Emily and the children. He was required to attend anger management classes. He lost his firearm permit, though whether he actually surrendered his guns was never verified. The restraining order was a piece of paper meant to stop a man who'd spent 18 years ignoring every boundary Emily tried to set. It was, predictably, ineffective. He started with calls from blocked numbers, heavy breathing followed by hang-ups. Then texts from new numbers, apologizing, begging, threatening, cycling through emotions like he was turning a dial. Emily documented everything, saved screenshots, reported violations to police who added them to the file, but seemed unable to do anything that actually stopped the harassment. 3 months after Emily left, Daniel showed up at her sister's house at 6 in the morning. He'd been drinking, driving around all night, working himself into a state where rational thought had been drowned by a toxic mix of alcohol and rage and the absolute certainty that Emily belonged to him and had no right to make decisions without his permission. He parked across the street and waited. Emily's sister saw his car when she looked out the window and immediately called 911, speaking in urgent whispers, trying not to wake Emily and the kids who were still sleeping. The dispatcher said officers were on their way. Stay inside. Keep the doors locked. Do not engage with him. But Emily woke up. She heard her sister on the phone and knew immediately what was happening. She looked out the window and saw Daniel's car, saw him sitting behind the wheel staring at the house with an expression that made her blood run cold. She should have stayed inside. She should have waited for police. But 18 years of trying to manage Daniel's emotions, of believing she could de-escalate if she just said the right thing in the right way, made her think she could talk him down one more time. She walked outside in her pajamas, approaching the car slowly with her hands visible, like she was approaching a wild animal. Daniel got out. They stood facing each other on the quiet suburban street as the sun was rising and birds were beginning their morning songs. Emily spoke first, asking him to please just leave. Please don't do this. Think about the kids. Later, neighbors would describe hearing her voice, come at first, trying to reason with him. Then his voice, getting louder, accusations and demands blending into incoherent rage. Then Emily's voice rising, telling him to leave, to go away, that she wasn't coming back. And that's when the tone shifted completely, when Daniel's anger transformed into something worse, into the cold determination of someone who decided that if he couldn't have her, no one would. The attack happened so fast that witnesses struggled to process what they were seeing. One moment, Daniel and Emily were arguing. The next, he had his hands around her throat, slamming her against his car, choking her while she clawed at his arms and kicked at his legs. Emily's sister ran outside screaming. A neighbor sprinted over, trying to pull Daniel off. It took 3 adult men to finally get him to let go, and by then Emily had gone limp. Paramedics arrived within minutes, performing CPR on the front lawn while police wrestled Daniel into handcuffs. He was screaming that she deserved it, that she'd driven him to this, that it was her fault for leaving. The children watched from the window, seeing their mother worked on by strangers while their father was shoved into a police car. Sarah held her younger siblings, all of them crying, their entire world imploding in real time. Emily was rushed to the hospital. Doctors worked frantically, but the damage was catastrophic. The combination of strangulation and blunt force trauma had caused injuries that even the best medical intervention couldn't reverse. She died 2 hours after arriving at the emergency room, surrounded by machines and strangers, without her children getting to say goodbye. Daniel was charged with murder. His lawyer attempted to argue diminished capacity due to alcohol intoxication and emotional distress. The prosecution presented mountains of evidence documenting 18 years of escalating abuse, 3 months of restraining order violations, and a premeditated attack on a woman who'd been trying to protect herself and her children. The trial was mercifully quick. Daniel showed no remorse, instead spending his testimony blaming Emily for destroying their family by leaving. He portrayed himself as the victim, a man driven to desperation by a wife who wouldn't listen to reason. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before convicting him on all charges. Sarah, now 17, gave a victim impact statement at sentencing that left the courtroom in tears. She described growing up in fear, watching her mother shrink over the years, seeing the light go out of her eyes even as she tried to smile and pretend everything was okay. She talked about the guilt she felt for not doing more to protect her mother, for not understanding sooner how bad things were. She ended by saying that she'd learned from her father exactly the kind of person she never wanted to become. Daniel received life in prison without possibility of parole. As he was led away, he looked back at his children and tried to say something, but Sarah turned her back on him, taking her younger siblings' hands and walking out. They were orphans now, in every meaningful sense of the word. Their mother was dead. Their father was gone. The family that had existed, dysfunctional as it was, had been completely destroyed. Emily's case sparked conversations about the inadequacy of restraining orders as protective measures. Statistics show that a significant percentage of domestic violence homicides occur after a restraining order has been issued, the paper barrier doing nothing to stop determined abusers. Advocates called for better enforcement, electronic monitoring of offenders, more resources for victims trying to leave dangerous situations. But reforms take time, and while legislators debate and policies are crafted, more women die at the hands of partners who've been abusing them for years. The pattern repeats with numbing regularity, escalating violence, failed interventions, a system that can't or won't protect victims until it's too late. Grieving families left to wonder why no one did more when the warning signs were so obvious. Emily Rowe tried everything she was supposed to do. She reported the abuse. She got a restraining order. She left. And she still died because the systems designed to protect her were inadequate against a man who'd spent 18 years believing he owned her. Her story isn't exceptional. It's tragically common, playing out in cities and towns across the country with such frequency that it barely makes news unless there's some detail unusual enough to capture public attention. The children are being raised by Emily's sister now, trying to build normal lives from the rubble of trauma. They're in therapy, all three of them, working through grief and anger and the complicated feelings that come from loving a father who killed their mother. There's no roadmap for that kind of emotional landscape. No guidebook that tells children how to reconcile the man who played catch with them in the backyard with the man who strangled their mother on a suburban street. Sarah graduated high school and deferred college for a year to help her aunt with her younger siblings. She volunteers at a domestic violence shelter, channeling her grief into trying to help other women in situations like her mother's. She speaks at schools about recognizing abuse, about the warning signs that she missed when she was younger, about the importance of supporting friends who might be in danger. It's painful work, reopening her wounds every time she tells Emily's story, but Sarah believes it matters. If even one person recognizes themselves in the narrative and chooses to leave before it's too late, then her mother's death might mean something beyond senseless tragedy. It's a heavy burden for a young person to carry, but trauma often forces maturity that should come naturally over years to instead arrive all at once. The transition from Emily's story requires acknowledgement of a different kind of failure, not of restraining orders or police response times, but of investigative competence. Sometimes the warning signs are clear, and the victim is trying desperately to be found, and the people whose job it is to search still fail in ways that beggar belief. Hannah Cole was 22 years old when she disappeared from North Shore City, a Canadian port town known for its vibrant nightlife and picturesque waterfront. She'd recently ended a relationship with her boyfriend of 3 years, a breakup that had been messy but not violent. They'd dated since freshman year of college, grown apart as people often do in their early 20s, and decided to go their separate ways while they still liked each other enough to be civil. The breakup left Hannah emotionally raw but also oddly liberated. For the first time since she was 19, she was single, free to make decisions based purely on what she wanted rather than coordinating with someone else's preferences and schedules. She went out more, reconnected with friends she'd neglected during the relationship, embraced the kind of social life she'd put on hold while being part of a couple. On a Friday night in October, Hannah met friends at a bar in the downtown entertainment district. They had drinks, danced, laughed at inside jokes, took selfies that captured the kind of youthful joy that comes from being young and healthy and convinced that the future holds unlimited possibility. Around midnight, Hannah said she was tired and was going to head home. Her friends offered to share a cab, but Hannah declined. She lived only a 15-minute walk away, and the streets were well lit and busy with other people also heading home. She left the bar at 12:17, captured on security cameras waving goodbye to her friends and heading east toward her apartment. She was alone, walking with the confident stride of someone who knew these streets, who'd walked them dozens of times without incident. She had her phone out, probably texting or checking social media, dividing her attention between the screen and the sidewalk. Surveillance footage tracked her for 3 blocks. She passed a convenience store where she was caught on camera from inside, just a figure walking past the window. She stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. And then she walked beyond the range of the cameras that had been chronicling her journey, stepping into a gap in coverage that would prove catastrophic. Hannah never made it home. Her roommate wasn't worried when she woke up Saturday morning and found Hannah's room empty. They had irregular schedules, often going days without seeing each other despite living in the same apartment. But by Sunday evening, when Hannah missed a family dinner she'd never have skipped without calling, her parents began to worry. They called her phone repeatedly. It went straight to voicemail. They contacted her friends, who said she'd left the bar Friday night planning to walk home. They drove to her apartment, finding her roommate who suddenly realized she hadn't seen Hannah all weekend. Together, they filed a missing person report with North Shore City Police. The initial investigation was competent on the surface, but fundamentally flawed in ways that wouldn't become apparent until much later. Police reviewed the surveillance footage, tracking Hannah's path for those 3 blocks. They interviewed the friends she'd been with at the bar, the roommate, the ex-boyfriend, anyone who might have information about her movements or state of mind. The ex-boyfriend became a person of interest immediately, as a standard procedure. The relationship had ended recently. Maybe Hannah had reconsidered. Maybe they'd met up and things had gone wrong. He was questioned extensively, his alibi checked and rechecked. Security footage from his apartment building showed him entering at 10 Friday night and not leaving until Saturday afternoon. His phone records confirmed he'd been home, texting friends, and browsing social media. He was cleared. The investigation then focused on Hannah's walk home, trying to determine what happened in the 15 minutes between leaving the bar and when she should have arrived at her apartment. Police canvassed the route, asking businesses for security footage, interviewing night workers who might have seen something. They found a few additional camera angles that showed Hannah walking, alone, seemingly unbothered, nothing unusual. And then she vanished. Somewhere between the last camera sighting and her apartment, Hannah stepped off the grid. Police theorized she'd been abducted, grabbed off the street by someone, possibly forced into a vehicle. They expanded their search, looking at traffic cameras for suspicious cars, interviewing registered sex offenders in the area, doing everything that the manual says to do when a young woman goes missing. But they made a critical error. When determining the search radius for her potential location, they assumed Hannah had continued east toward her apartment. They mapped out areas based on that assumption, focusing their ground searches on parks and wooded areas in the eastern part of the city. What they failed to adequately consider was the possibility that Hannah had changed direction, either voluntarily or because someone had forced her to. Weeks passed, then months. Hannah's face appeared on missing person posters throughout North Shore City. Her family held vigils. News coverage gradually faded as newer stories displaced her disappearance from headlines. The case went cold, joining the heartbreaking roster of unsolved missing person cases that haunt police departments and families equally. 3 years later, a construction crew preparing to demolish an abandoned warehouse on the west side of the city made a discovery that would reignite the investigation and expose the catastrophic failure of the initial search. In a storage room filled with debris and old equipment, they found human remains. The body had been there for years, decomposed but intact enough for identification. It was Hannah Cole. She'd been less than a mile from the bar where she'd been drinking with friends, in the opposite direction from her apartment, in an area that police had barely searched because it didn't fit their theory of her movements. The warehouse had been empty and scheduled for demolition since before Hannah disappeared, a perfect place to hide a body if you knew the building was abandoned and unlikely to be entered. The discovery devastated her family and outraged the public. Hannah had been there the whole time, less than a mile from where she was last seen, while police had been searching on the wrong side of the city. If they'd expanded their initial search radius, if they'd checked abandoned buildings more thoroughly, if they'd questioned their assumptions about which direction she'd gone, they might have found her much sooner. The autopsy revealed that Hannah had died the same night she disappeared, likely within hours of leaving the bar. The cause of death was determined to be manual strangulation. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms, evidence that she'd fought her attacker. The forensic examination also recovered DNA evidence, biological material that would prove crucial in eventually identifying her killer. But identifying the killer took time. The DNA didn't match anyone in the local database. Police expanded their search nationally, then internationally, running the profile through every system available. Years passed with no hits, no matches, no breaks in the case. Hannah's family endured the unique torture of knowing their daughter was dead and knowing someone had killed her, but having no one to hold accountable. The break finally came 6 years after Hannah's disappearance, when a man was arrested in another province for assault. As part of standard procedure, his DNA was collected and entered into the database. The system flagged a match to the Hannah Cole case. The man's name was Trevor Morrison, and at the time of Hannah's murder, he'd been living in North Shore City, working night shifts at a warehouse less than 2 blocks from where her body was found. Trevor had no prior criminal record when Hannah died, which is why his DNA wasn't in any database. He'd been interviewed during the initial investigation as part of the general canvass of the area, but nothing had stood out about him. He'd seemed cooperative, expressed sympathy about the missing woman, mentioned he worked nights and hadn't seen anything unusual. Police had thanked him for his time and moved on, never suspecting they were talking to the killer. His arrest on assault charges years later was for attacking a woman he'd met at a bar, a situation that echoed Hannah's last night in chilling ways. The woman had fought him off and escaped, reporting the assault immediately. When Trevor's DNA was collected and matched to Hannah's case, investigators realized they were dealing with someone who'd been assaulting women for years, probably getting away with it until he finally went too far. Confronted with the DNA evidence linking him to Hannah's murder, Trevor initially denied everything. Then he claimed they'd had consensual sex and she'd left alive. When the forensic evidence made that story impossible, he changed tactics, saying it was an accident during rough sex. He'd panicked and hidden the body instead of calling for help. The prosecution demolished this defense. The forensic evidence showed a violent struggle, not consensual activity gone wrong. The location of the body in an abandoned warehouse Trevor had access to through his job suggested premeditation and knowledge of a place to hide evidence. The pattern of attacking women in bars created a profile of someone who hunted victims deliberately, not someone who'd had a tragic accident. Trevor Morrison was convicted of first-degree murder. The judge noted the calculated nature of the crime, the defendant's complete lack of remorse, and the years of lying even when confronted with irrefutable evidence. He received a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years. For Hannah's family, the conviction brought a measure of closure but couldn't erase the years of wondering, the torture of not knowing, and the anger at how badly the initial investigation had failed their daughter. They filed complaints against the police department, leading to an internal review that identified multiple failures in the search protocol and decision-making process. The review was scathing. It found that investigators had locked onto a theory about Hannah's likely path too early and had failed to adequately search areas that didn't fit that theory. It criticized the narrow search radius, the inadequate canvassing of abandoned buildings, and the failure to recognize Trevor Morrison as a potential suspect despite him working in the immediate area where Hannah's body was eventually found. Reforms were implemented. Expanded search protocols, requirements for checking all abandoned structures within a wider radius, better training on avoiding confirmation bias during investigations. These changes came too late for Hannah, but they represented acknowledgement that the system had failed and needed to improve. Hannah's mother became an advocate for families of missing persons, working with organizations that help navigate the trauma of having a loved one disappear. She speaks about the importance of persistent advocacy, of not accepting easy answers from investigators, of trusting your instincts when something feels wrong about how a case is being handled. It's difficult work, reliving her daughter's disappearance over and over by helping other families through similar nightmares. But she finds meaning in it, a way to channel grief into action, to ensure that Hannah's death wasn't completely meaningless. If her advocacy helps even one family get answers sooner, helps one investigation avoid the mistakes that plagued Hannah's case, then perhaps there's some small redemption in the tragedy. The pattern we're seeing across these cases starts to become clear now. Warning signs ignored. Systems failing. People dismissed or overlooked. It's not that these crimes were unsolvable mysteries. They were preventable tragedies that happened because people with power to intervene either didn't or couldn't or wouldn't. And nowhere is this more apparent than in cases involving young victims. People whose age should have triggered extra protection, but instead seemed to make them easier to dismiss. Lucia Moreno was 16 years old when she met Diego Salvat at a community festival in San Alboran, a city in South America known for its colonial architecture and vibrant street life. Diego was 23, old enough that the age gap should have raised immediate red flags. But in the circles they moved in, such relationships weren't uncommon or particularly scandalous. Older boys dated younger girls. It was just how things were. Diego was charming, attentive in ways that made Lucia feel special and mature. He had a car and a job and freedom that she, still living with her parents and attending high school, could only dream about. He bought her gifts, took her to restaurants, treated her like an adult rather than a kid. To Lucia, it felt like love. To everyone outside looking in with more life experience, it looked like grooming. Lucia's parents were uncomfortable with the relationship from the start. They tried to forbid her from seeing Diego, but this only drove the relationship underground, transforming it into a forbidden romance that felt even more exciting. Lucia would sneak out to meet him, lying about where she was going, creating elaborate cover stories. Her parents' opposition became fuel for the relationship rather than a deterrent. Diego was controlling in ways that Lucia initially interpreted as protective. He wanted to know where she was all the time, who she was talking to, what she was doing. He got jealous when she spent time with friends, especially male friends, even when those friendships were completely innocent. He isolated her gradually, making her feel guilty for wanting to spend time with anyone but him. Red flags appeared with increasing frequency. Diego had a temper that flared over small things, a dishonest comment or a perceived slight, anything that challenged his sense of control. He never hit Lucia, but he'd punch walls, throw objects, drive recklessly when angry with her in the car. These behaviors terrified her, but also made her feel responsible for managing his emotions, for being good enough that he wouldn't get upset. Lucia's friends watched this transformation with growing concern. The girl who'd been outgoing and confident became quiet and anxious, constantly checking her phone to respond to Diego's texts, making excuses when his behavior was obviously unacceptable. They tried talking to her, pointing out that healthy relationships didn't look like this, that his jealousy wasn't romantic. But Lucia defended him, insisting they didn't understand, that he loved her, that they were meant to be together. Her school counselor noticed changes too, grades slipping, participation dropping, a general withdrawal from activities Lucia had previously enjoyed. When the counselor gently asked if everything was okay at home or in her personal life, Lucia brushed off the concerns, saying she was just tired, stressed about exams, nothing serious. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere, flashing like emergency lights. But adolescent relationships are notoriously difficult for adults to intervene in, falling into a gray area where concerned parties don't want to overreact to normal teenage drama, but also don't want to miss genuine danger. In Lucia's case, everyone who cared about her was trying to find the right balance, and while they were trying, the situation was escalating toward catastrophe. The night Lucia disappeared, she told her parents she was studying at a friend's house. Instead, she went to a party with Diego, one of those gatherings that spring up spontaneously in someone's house when their parents are out of town. There was alcohol and music and the kind of chaotic teenage social dynamics that feel important in the moment and trivial in retrospect. Multiple witnesses would later report seeing Lucia and Diego arguing at the party. The fight was loud enough that people noticed, something about Lucia talking to another boy, Diego accusing her of flirting, Lucia defending herself and saying she was just being friendly. Diego grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks, trying to pull her outside. Lucia resisted, telling him to stop, that he was hurting her. A few partygoers intervened, telling Diego to calm down, to let go of Lucia. He did, but his expression was dark with rage barely contained. Lucia looked shaken but tried to laugh it off, saying they were fine. It was just a misunderstanding. She went outside to talk to Diego privately, apparently trying to smooth things over. to reassure him that he had nothing to be jealous about. That was the last time anyone at the party saw her. Diego's car was seen leaving around 11, but whether Lucia was in it remained unclear. Some witnesses thought they saw her in the passenger seat. Others weren't sure. The darkness and chaos of the party made reliable observations difficult. Lucia's phone last pinged off a cell tower 20 miles outside the city at 11:45 that night. Then it went silent, either turned off or destroyed or moved beyond cell service range. Her parents didn't realize she was missing until the next morning when she didn't come home. They called the friend whose house she was supposedly studying at and learned Lucia had never been there. Panic set in immediately. Lucia had never stayed out all night without permission. She was irresponsible sometimes, like most teenagers, but not like this. Her parents called Diego's phone repeatedly. It rang, but he didn't answer. They drove to his apartment and found it empty. They filed a missing person report with police, explaining about Diego, about the problematic relationship, about their fears that he'd done something to their daughter. The police response was inadequate in ways that would later fuel bitter anger and recriminations. Because Lucia was 16 and had a pattern of sneaking out to see her boyfriend, the initial assumption was that she'd run away with him, that they'd eloped or were hiding out somewhere having a teenage adventure. The officers took the report but didn't treat it with the urgency that a missing child should have triggered. Lucia's parents insisted this was different, that their daughter wouldn't just disappear without contact, that Diego was dangerous. The police nodded and took notes, but seemed skeptical. Teenagers run away. They make impulsive choices. Just give it a few days, and she'd probably turn up embarrassed but safe. Days passed without any sign of Lucia. Her face appeared on local news broadcasts. Her parents distributed flyers throughout the city, organizing search parties that scoured parks and wooded areas. Diego's family claimed they didn't know where he was either, that he'd left town suddenly without explanation. His car was found abandoned at a bus station 3 days after Lucia disappeared, wiped clean of fingerprints, emptied of anything personal. The discovery of the abandoned car finally elevated the case in police priority. This wasn't a couple of teenagers running away together. Diego had fled, alone, taking steps to avoid detection. Lucia was genuinely missing, and the most likely scenario was that Diego had done something terrible and run. But finding Diego proved difficult. He'd taken a bus to another city, then apparently continued moving, staying off-grid, using cash, avoiding cameras. He had family in rural areas where people protected their own and didn't cooperate with police inquiries. He knew how to disappear, and he used that knowledge to stay ahead of the investigation. Lucia's parents lived in agonizing limbo, not knowing if their daughter was alive or dead, hoping for her return while simultaneously bracing for the worst news. They became experts in missing person advocacy, learning the systems and procedures, pushing police to do more, to search harder, to treat their daughter's disappearance with the seriousness it deserved. Media coverage intensified the pressure on police to find answers. The story had elements that captured public attention. A young girl, a controlling older boyfriend, a disappearance after an argument, a suspect on the run. People across the country followed the case, shared Lucia's photo, called in tips that mostly led nowhere, but occasionally provided useful information. One such tip led police to a remote area where Diego had family property. Investigators searched the land thoroughly, using dogs and ground-penetrating radar, looking for any sign of Lucia. They found nothing conclusive, just enough circumstantial evidence to suggest Diego had been there recently, but not enough to prove he'd brought Lucia or what he might have done. The case went cold after 6 months of intensive investigation. Diego remained at large, presumably still in the country, but successfully evading detection. Lucia remained missing, her fate unknown. Her parents clung to hope that she might still be alive, that maybe Diego was keeping her somewhere, that they might still get their daughter back. But as time passed, hope became harder to maintain. The reality that most people wanted to avoid saying out loud was that Lucia was almost certainly dead, murdered by a boyfriend who couldn't handle her having any independence, whose jealousy and control had escalated to violence when she dared to talk to another boy at a party. Years later, the case remains unsolved. Diego Salvat is still wanted for questioning in connection with Lucia Marino's disappearance. There have been reported sightings over the years, tips that he's living in various remote communities under assumed names, but none have led to his capture. Lucia's parents continue to advocate for missing children, working with organizations that help families navigate the nightmare of having a child vanish. The institutional indifference they experienced haunts them. If police had taken the case seriously from day one, if they'd mobilized resources immediately instead of assuming a runaway teen, if they'd moved faster to find Diego before he fled, might the outcome have been different? These questions have no answers, but they persist, echoing through every interaction with other families facing similar situations. Lucia's case represents a particular kind of tragedy where age works against the victim. She was 16, old enough that authorities treated her disappearance as less urgent than a younger child's, but young enough that she lacked the life experience to recognize the danger she was in. The relationship with Diego was allowed to continue despite numerous red flags because interfering in teenage relationships is complicated and uncomfortable and fraught with the possibility of making things worse. But sometimes making things worse by intervening is still better than allowing them to continue toward their natural, terrible conclusion. Lucia might have hated her parents for forcing her to break up with Diego. She might have been angry and resentful and felt like they didn't understand. But she'd be alive, and eventually she'd have gained the perspective to understand they were protecting her. Instead, she's gone. Another young person lost to violence that everyone saw coming, but no one managed to stop. The pattern continues, shifting now to a different kind of manipulation, one that happens not in person, but through screens and keyboards, where predators cultivate victims they've never met in person, building psychological control through words alone. Thomas Reed never saw the person who would orchestrate his murder. He exchanged messages, developed what he thought was a meaningful connection, and never realized he was being maneuvered like a chess piece toward his own death. Thomas was 41, married for 16 years to Rebecca Reed, with 2 teenage daughters who were the center of his world until the marriage started crumbling. Like many long-term relationships, theirs had degraded slowly, passion fading into routine decaying into resentment. They stopped talking about anything meaningful. They existed in the same house like roommates who didn't particularly like each other. Rebecca found escape online, joining forums and chat groups where she could be someone other than a frustrated wife and tired mother. She created personas, experimented with different versions of herself, found validation in virtual spaces that her real life didn't provide. It was harmless at first, just a distraction, a way to feel seen and interesting and desirable in ways her marriage had stopped making her feel. But distraction became obsession, and harmless fantasy started warping into something darker. Rebecca began spending hours every day online, neglecting household responsibilities, becoming irritated when family obligations interrupted her digital life. Thomas noticed the changes but attributed them to the general malaise of their dying marriage, not recognizing that his wife was developing a whole separate existence that had nothing to do with him. Rebecca met Victor Hale in an online support group for people dealing with difficult marriages. Victor was 52, a retired police officer living alone and struggling with depression after his divorce. He was lonely, vulnerable, and susceptible to the kind of emotional manipulation that Rebecca, whether consciously or unconsciously, began deploying. She cultivated him carefully, sharing details about her unhappy marriage, painting Thomas as controlling and emotionally abusive. None of this was true, but Victor had no way to verify her claims. He only knew the version of Rebecca she presented, a woman trapped in a terrible situation, desperate for escape, but seeing no way out. Rebecca's goal, initially, was unclear even to herself. Was she just venting? Creating drama to make her life feel more interesting? Or was she, on some level, moving pieces into position for something far more sinister? The psychological analysis would later debate her intent, but the results were undeniable. She told Victor that Thomas wouldn't agree to divorce, that he'd threatened to take the children, to ruin her financially, to make her life hell if she tried to leave. She said she was afraid of him, that he had a temper, that she didn't know what he might do if pushed too far. Again, none of this was true. Thomas had never threatened her. If anything, he'd suggested they try counseling to fix the marriage. But Victor believed Rebecca's version of events because he wanted to believe her, because the narrative of rescuing a woman in distress gave his life meaning it had been lacking. He started expressing anger at Thomas on Rebecca's behalf, calling him names, suggesting he deserved to suffer for how he was treating her. Rebecca encouraged this anger, fed it with more fabricated stories of Thomas's alleged abuse. She'd describe arguments that never happened, escalating the severity of Thomas's supposed behavior with each telling. Victor's protective instincts transformed into something darker, a conviction that Thomas Reed was a monster who needed to be stopped. The leap from angry talk to actual planning happened gradually, so slowly that Victor might not have recognized it as a leap at all. Rebecca started asking hypothetical questions. What would someone do if they needed to escape an abusive situation but had no legal recourse? How might someone protect themselves from a violent partner? The questions were phrased as desperate seeking of options, not as solicitation of murder, but the intent was clear to anyone examining the conversations later. Victor started suggesting solutions. The suggestions were initially vague, talking around the subject without saying it directly. But as Rebecca expressed appreciation for his willingness to help, as she reinforced that he was the only person who understood her situation, who really cared about her safety, Victor became bolder. He started talking about how someone with police training could make a person disappear, how it could be done without evidence, how no one would know. Rebecca never explicitly asked Victor to kill Thomas. Her lawyers would later emphasize this point repeatedly. She'd created the fiction of an abusive husband, manipulated a lonely man into seeing himself as a rescuer, and let Victor draw his own conclusions about what needed to happen. It was manipulation so calculated that it bordered on brilliant, if brilliance can be applied to something so fundamentally evil. Victor decided on his own, or at least convinced himself he had, that killing Thomas was necessary to protect Rebecca. He drove across 3 states to the city where the Reeds lived, bringing with him the knowledge of police procedures that would help him avoid detection. He watched Thomas for days, learning his routines, looking for opportunities. Thomas had no idea he was being stalked, no clue that his wife had painted him as a monster to a stranger who now considered murdering him a noble act. He went to work, came home, helped his daughters with homework, tried to have civil conversations with Rebecca despite the coldness between them. He was living a normal life, unaware that it was about to end. The murder happened in the Reed family garage on a Thursday evening. Thomas was working on his car, routine maintenance he'd been putting off for weeks. Victor entered through the side door that Rebecca had deliberately left unlocked. Thomas looked up from under the hood, confused to see a stranger in his garage, and those were the last moments of his life. Victor shot him 3 times with a handgun he'd purchased illegally specifically for this purpose. Thomas died quickly, collapsing onto the concrete floor of his own garage while his family was inside the house. Rebecca was upstairs with their daughters, establishing her alibi, making sure she could truthfully say she was nowhere near the garage when the shots were fired. Victor fled immediately, his police training guiding him in avoiding cameras and taking routes that would make tracking difficult. He returned home, disposed of the gun, and waited to see if he'd gotten away with it. For a few weeks, it seemed he had. Police investigated Thomas's murder, but had no suspects, no clear motive, no evidence pointing in any useful direction. But Victor couldn't live with what he'd done. The guilt consumed him, worsening his existing depression into something unbearable. He started drinking heavily, barely eating, unable to sleep without nightmares of Thomas's face in those final confused moments. 2 months after the murder, Victor wrote a confession and mailed it to the police department in the city where Thomas had been killed. The letter detailed everything: meeting Rebecca online, believing her stories about abuse, deciding that killing Thomas was the only way to save her, carrying out the murder. He included details only the killer would know, facts that hadn't been released to the public. He signed his name and included his address, making no attempt to avoid arrest. Police picked up Victor the same day they received the letter. He confessed again in person, walking them through every step of the process. When they asked about Rebecca's involvement, Victor initially insisted she'd had no idea he was planning to kill Thomas, that he'd acted alone to help a woman who'd been suffering. It was almost chivalrous in a deeply disturbed way, his attempt to protect her even as he admitted to murder. But investigators weren't convinced. They obtained warrants for Rebecca's electronic communications, finding thousands of messages between her and Victor. The psychological manipulation was evident in every conversation, the careful cultivation of his anger, the presentation of Thomas as a threat, the creation of a narrative that positioned violence as necessary. Rebecca was arrested 3 weeks after Victor. She maintained her innocence, claiming she'd just been venting to an online friend, that she'd never wanted Thomas dead, that Victor had acted on his own delusions. Her lawyers argued that talking about problems in a marriage wasn't the same as soliciting murder, that Rebecca couldn't be held responsible for Victor's independent decision to kill her husband. The prosecution disagreed. They presented the message logs as evidence of a deliberate campaign to manipulate Victor into committing murder. They brought in psychological experts who explained how Rebecca had exploited Victor's vulnerabilities, his loneliness, his depression, his need to feel useful and heroic. They argued that while Rebecca might not have explicitly said "kill my husband," her actions had that exact intent and result. The trials were separate, adding complexity to an already complicated case. Victor pleaded guilty, expressing remorse and accepting full responsibility for pulling the trigger. His sentencing hearing was emotional, with Thomas's family giving statements about the devastation of losing their father and husband to senseless violence orchestrated by his own wife. Victor received life in prison. He would later appeal, arguing that his mental state at the time of the murder should be considered, that his depression and vulnerability to manipulation diminished his culpability. The appeals were denied. He remains incarcerated, reportedly still in contact with Rebecca despite everything, their toxic connection apparently unbroken even by prison walls. Rebecca's trial was longer and more contentious. The defense painted her as a desperate woman in an unhappy marriage who'd sought emotional support online and been horrified when that support turned into murder. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded manipulator who'd orchestrated her husband's death while keeping her own hands clean. The jury struggled with the case. Rebecca hadn't pulled the trigger. She hadn't been present when Thomas died. But the evidence of manipulation was overwhelming. The pattern of conversations clearly designed to push Victor toward violence. After days of deliberation, they convicted her of conspiracy to commit murder and criminal solicitation. Sentencing became controversial. Rebecca received 25 years, significantly less than Victor's life sentence despite many arguing she was more culpable as the architect of the plot. The disparity sparked debates about how the justice system treats different types of involvement in crimes, how it values the person who pulls the trigger versus the person who loads the gun and points it at the target. Thomas and Rebecca's daughters lost both parents that day in the garage, their father to violence and their mother to her own choices. They were raised by Thomas's sister, growing up with the knowledge that their mother had orchestrated their father's murder because she didn't want to go through the inconvenience of divorce. It's a burden no child should carry, the understanding that one parent valued their own comfort over the other parent's life. The case highlighted the dangers of online relationships, how easy it is to manipulate people through screens when you can curate what they know about you, when you can lie without the physical tells that might give you away in person. Victor never stood a chance against Rebecca's campaign. He was vulnerable, and she exploited that vulnerability with precision, turning him into a weapon aimed at her own husband. But it also raised questions about responsibility and mental state. Victor was an adult who chose to drive across the country and shoot someone. The fact that Rebecca manipulated him doesn't erase his agency, his decision to commit murder rather than recognize he was being used. The division of culpability between them remains debated, with valid arguments on multiple sides about who bears more blame for Thomas Reed's death. What's undeniable is that Thomas died for no reason beyond Rebecca's selfishness and cowardice. If she wanted out of the marriage, divorce was available. It would have been difficult and possibly expensive, but it was an option that didn't involve murder. Instead, she chose manipulation and violence, destroying not just Thomas but Victor and their daughters and everyone connected to this tragedy. The pattern shifts again, moving from online manipulation to the elaborate staging of crime scenes, the deployment of misdirection and false evidence designed to send investigations in wrong directions. Rachel Turner's husband thought he was clever, that his plan to make her disappearance look like foul play committed by someone else would work. He almost succeeded. Rachel was 34, in the middle of a contentious divorce from Daniel Turner after 8 years of marriage. They had one daughter, 6-year-old Emma, who'd become the focal point of their battle. Both parents wanted primary custody. Both were willing to fight dirty to get it. The divorce had turned into warfare, with accusations flying from both sides. Rachel claimed Daniel was psychologically abusive and an unfit parent. Daniel claimed Rachel was mentally unstable and alienating Emma from him. Their lawyers traded increasingly hostile motions, each seeking to paint the other parent in the worst possible light. The judge overseeing the case had grown visibly frustrated with their inability to cooperate, even on basic co-parenting decisions. Custody evaluation was scheduled for early December, with both parents required to undergo psychological testing and home visits. Rachel was confident she'd come out ahead. She'd been Emma's primary caregiver throughout the marriage. She had a stable job and a support network. Daniel worked long hours and had no family nearby. The evaluator would surely see that Emma belonged primarily with her mother. Daniel saw things differently. He'd spent weeks preparing for the evaluation, cleaning his apartment obsessively, documenting every interaction with Rachel, building a case that he was the stable parent while Rachel was erratic and hostile. But as the evaluation date approached, he began to panic. What if it didn't go his way? What if the evaluator recommended Rachel get primary custody? He couldn't lose his daughter. He wouldn't. The planning started subtly. Research into how missing person cases were investigated, what evidence police looked for, how to create a plausible alternative suspect. Daniel had always been detail-oriented, someone who approached problems methodically. He applied that same analytical mindset to planning his wife's murder, treating it like a project with steps and timelines and contingencies. Rachel disappeared on a Saturday morning in late November. She'd arranged to drop Emma at Daniel's apartment for his weekend parenting time, a handoff that had become routine despite the ongoing divorce battle. Security cameras in Daniel's building showed Rachel entering at 9:15 with Emma, leaving alone at 9:23. That 5-minute window would prove crucial. Rachel's car was found abandoned in a grocery store parking lot 3 miles from Daniel's apartment. Her purse was inside, wallet missing, phone smashed on the ground nearby. Blood was splattered on the driver's seat and door, suggesting violence had occurred. The scene looked like a carjacking or abduction, random violence in a parking lot. Police investigated accordingly, interviewing employees and reviewing security footage from the grocery store. They found nothing useful. The cameras didn't cover the area where Rachel's car was parked. No witnesses reported seeing anything suspicious. The case seemed to be a random crime. Terrible luck, wrong place, wrong time. But Rachel's family didn't believe it. The timing, right before a custody evaluation that Rachel expected to win, seemed too convenient. They pressured police to look more closely at Daniel, to consider the possibility that Rachel's ex-husband had something to do with her disappearance. Detectives were skeptical but agreed to investigate. Daniel seemed genuinely distraught about Rachel's disappearance. He cooperated fully with police, allowing them to search his apartment, providing access to his phone records and financial statements. He expressed concern for Emma, who was asking when mommy would be home. He painted a picture of himself as a worried co-parent, hoping Rachel would be found safe despite their divorce conflicts. The investigation might have stalled there if not for a small inconsistency that caught a detective's attention. The blood in Rachel's car, tested preliminarily in the field, showed markers suggesting it wasn't entirely human. Further laboratory analysis revealed it was a mixture of human blood and fish blood, a bizarre combination that made no sense in a random carjacking scenario. This discovery prompted a more thorough forensic examination of Daniel's apartment. Investigators found traces of blood in his bathroom, in the grout between tiles, places that had been cleaned but not perfectly. The blood was Rachel's. They also found evidence of fish blood, matching the sample from the car. Daniel had purchased salmon from a fish market the day before Rachel disappeared, paying cash, unusual for him as he typically used credit cards. The pieces started fitting together into a disturbing picture. Daniel had killed Rachel in his apartment during that 5-minute window when Emma was presumably in another room. He'd used fish blood mixed with Rachel's to stage the scene in her car, creating the appearance of a violent carjacking. He'd then somehow transported Rachel's body to a location yet to be discovered. Confronted with this evidence, Daniel's demeanor changed. The concerned ex-husband mask slipped, revealing cold calculation underneath. He lawyered up immediately, refusing to answer any more questions. But his silence couldn't erase the forensic evidence linking him to Rachel's blood and the staged crime scene. The search for Rachel's body became urgent. Police believed Daniel had disposed of her somewhere, but where? They examined his phone's GPS data, his credit card receipts, anything that might indicate where he'd gone after killing her. They found a purchase from a hardware store, bleach and cleaning supplies and plastic sheeting, bought at 6 in the morning the day after Rachel disappeared. The hardware store's security footage showed Daniel making the purchase, looking exhausted and jumpy, constantly glancing around like he expected to be caught. The items suggested he'd cleaned up the murder scene, but they didn't indicate where he'd put Rachel's body. Investigators expanded their search to areas Daniel had connections to, places he might know were isolated enough to hide a body. They found property owned by Daniel's deceased father 50 miles outside the city, a rural lot with an old barn that hadn't been used in years. Cadaver dogs alerted in the barn, leading investigators to disturbed earth in the corner. They found Rachel buried under 3 feet of dirt and debris, wrapped in plastic sheeting matching the type Daniel had purchased from the hardware store. The autopsy revealed she'd been strangled, consistent with Daniel's physical strength and the confined space of his apartment bathroom where the blood traces had been found. Daniel was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Rachel's blood in his apartment, the staged crime scene with fish blood, the purchase of supplies used to bury her body, and the body itself found on his family's property. His trial was almost perfunctory, the defense unable to create reasonable doubt against the mountain of forensic and circumstantial evidence. The jury convicted him quickly. At sentencing, Rachel's family gave impact statements that painted a picture of a vibrant woman, a devoted mother, someone whose only crime was trying to escape a marriage to a man who'd rather kill her than lose a custody battle. They spoke directly to Emma, who'd lost her mother and would grow up knowing her father was in prison for murder, trying to convey how much Rachel had loved her. Daniel received life in prison without possibility of parole. He maintained his innocence throughout, claiming he'd been framed, that someone else had killed Rachel and planted evidence to implicate him. No one believed him. The evidence was too clear, his motive too obvious, his attempts at misdirection too transparent. Emma was placed with Rachel's sister, growing up in a household that kept her mother's memory alive, while trying to shield her from the worst details of how she died. The psychological impact of having her father murder her mother during what should have been a routine custody exchange will follow Emma for life, shaping her understanding of relationships and trust in ways therapy can help with, but never fully heal. Daniel's case demonstrated the lengths some people will go to maintain control, how domestic disputes can escalate to homicide when someone sees losing a battle as unacceptable. The staging of the crime scene showed premeditation and a belief that he was smart enough to fool police, that his plan was clever enough to create reasonable doubt. But murder investigations have advanced significantly. Forensic science catches details that criminals think they've covered up. Digital traces reveal movements and purchases that create timelines of guilt. And ultimately, it's almost impossible to kill someone you have a relationship with and leave no evidence, because the connection between you creates countless opportunities for forensic links. Rachel's murder was solvable because Daniel couldn't anticipate every variable, couldn't clean every trace, couldn't account for fish blood being identifiable or GPS data being subpoenaed or cadaver dogs alerting on his family's property. His intelligence worked against him, creating an elaborate plan that was actually easier to unravel than a simpler crime might have been. The next case involves a different kind of challenge for investigators, a murder without a body, a situation where prosecutors had to prove someone was dead and convince a jury that a specific person killed them despite being unable to show where or how exactly the victim had died. It's one of the most difficult types of cases to prosecute, requiring circumstantial evidence so strong it overcomes the absence of the most fundamental proof that a crime occurred. Natalie Brooks was 28 years old, working the night shift as a nurse at a hospital in Lakeshore County. She was dedicated to her job, the kind of person who'd volunteered for the least desirable shifts because someone had to do them and she didn't mind. Her colleagues described her as reliable, always showing up on time, never calling in sick unless absolutely necessary. She lived alone in a small apartment, kept to herself mostly, had a few close friends, but wasn't particularly social. She was saving money to go back to school, planning to become a nurse practitioner, working toward a future she'd never get to see. On a Thursday in March, Natalie finished her shift at 7 in the morning and left the hospital heading home. Colleagues saw her walk to her car in the employee parking lot, saw her drive away. Security footage confirmed she left the hospital grounds at 7:12. She should have been home by 7:30. She never arrived. Natalie's car was found that afternoon in a rest stop 30 miles from the hospital, parked in a corner spot away from the main building. The doors were unlocked. Her purse was on the passenger seat, wallet and phone still inside. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no evidence of what had happened to her. Police reviewed security footage from the rest stop. The cameras showed Natalie pulling in at 7:25, parking, and sitting in her car for several minutes. Then a white van pulled up beside her, blocking the camera's view of her driver's side door. When the van left 5 minutes later, Natalie's car was empty. She was gone. The investigation focused on identifying the white van. The footage wasn't clear enough to capture license plate details, but investigators could see it was a commercial vehicle, possibly a work van. They canvassed businesses in the area looking for vehicles matching that description, interviewing owners and checking alibis. One name kept appearing in the investigation: Evan Porter, a maintenance contractor who owned a white van matching the description from the footage. More concerning, Evan's van had been spotted near Natalie's apartment complex multiple times over the previous month. Neighbors reported seeing it parked on the street, a man sitting inside watching the buildings. When police interviewed Evan, he claimed to have legitimate reasons for being in Natalie's neighborhood. He'd been bidding on maintenance contracts for several buildings in the area. As for the rest stop, he admitted being there that morning but claimed he'd stopped for coffee and hadn't seen Natalie. His story was plausible enough that without more evidence, police couldn't arrest him. But investigators kept digging. They found disturbing patterns in Evan's history. He'd been accused of stalking 2 different women in previous years, though neither case had resulted in charges. He'd been fired from jobs for making female co-workers uncomfortable. He had a collection of photographs on his computer showing women who appeared to have been photographed without their knowledge. None of this proved he'd killed Natalie, but it painted a picture of someone with an unhealthy interest in women, someone who crossed boundaries and made people uncomfortable. Detectives became convinced Evan was responsible for Natalie's disappearance, but without her body, without concrete evidence connecting him to her beyond being in the same rest stop, they couldn't build a prosecutable case. Months passed. The search for Natalie continued, but found nothing. Her family held vigils, kept her story in the news, pressured police not to give up. They became convinced, as investigators had, that Evan Porter had taken Natalie, and they wanted him held accountable. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A woman in another state reported being followed by a white van, managed to get the license plate number, and called police. The van was registered to Evan Porter. When police interviewed this woman, she described behavior eerily similar to what witnesses had reported seeing before Natalie's disappearance: the van following her, parking outside her work, the driver watching her movements. This gave investigators probable cause to search Evan's van and property. They found a wealth of disturbing evidence: photographs of multiple women, including Natalie, taken from a distance in what appeared to be surveillance. They found rope and duct tape and tools that could be used to restrain someone. They found cleaning supplies and plastic sheeting similar to what Daniel Turner had used to bury Rachel. Most damning, they found traces of Natalie's DNA in the back of Evan's van, hair and skin cells that placed her in that vehicle. Combined with the security footage showing his van at the rest stop when Natalie disappeared, this evidence was enough to arrest him. But the district attorney faced a dilemma. They had evidence Natalie had been in Evan's van. They had footage of him at the location where she disappeared. They had a pattern of stalking behavior, but they didn't have a body. They couldn't prove Natalie was actually dead, let alone that Evan had killed her. The decision to prosecute a murder case without a body is never taken lightly. It requires overwhelming circumstantial evidence, witnesses who can establish the victim would never voluntarily disappear, and forensic proof that something violent occurred. The prosecution team spent months building their case, consulting with experts, preparing for every defense argument about the absence of remains. They charged Evan Porter with first-degree murder. His defense attorney attacked the lack of a body immediately, arguing that the state couldn't even prove a crime had occurred. Maybe Natalie had chosen to disappear. Maybe she'd started a new life somewhere. Without a body, There was no proof she was dead. The prosecution methodically dismantled this argument. They brought Natalie's friends and family to testify about her character, her dedication to her job, her close relationship with her mother, whom she called daily. They showed that Natalie's phone had been turned off within an hour of her disappearance and never turned back on. Her bank accounts had no activity after that morning. Her social security number hadn't been used anywhere in the country since she vanished. They presented the DNA evidence from Evan's van, explaining how the distribution of hair and skin cells suggested she'd been in the cargo area rather than being a passenger, consistent with being held against her will. They brought in the women Evan had stalked previously, showing a pattern of escalating behavior that culminated in Natalie's disappearance. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The defense hammered on the absence of a body, the inability to prove cause of death, the theoretical possibility that Natalie was alive somewhere. But the prosecution's circumstantial case was strong, building layer upon layer of evidence that led to one inescapable conclusion. Evan Porter had abducted Natalie Brooks from that rest stop, killed her, and disposed of her body somewhere it hadn't been found. The jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. It was one of the first successful prosecutions in the state for murder without a body, setting legal precedent that would influence future cases. Evan was sentenced to life without parole. He never admitted what he did with Natalie's body. Despite being offered considerations for revealing the location, despite pleas from Natalie's family who just wanted to bring their daughter home for burial, Evan remained silent. It was his final act of control, denying Natalie's family even the closure of laying her to rest. But the conviction sent an important message. You can't literally get away with murder just because you successfully hide the body. The justice system can and will hold killers accountable even when the most fundamental piece of evidence is missing. It's harder, it requires more work and more proof, but it's possible. Natalie's case also revealed a disturbing pattern. After Evan's arrest, police in 3 other states contacted investigators about unsolved disappearances of young women in areas where Evan had lived or worked. The cases shared similarities: women living alone, last seen in parking lots or rest stops, white vans spotted nearby. Evan became a suspect in multiple disappearances, though proving his involvement without bodies or concrete evidence proved difficult. The possibility that Natalie wasn't Evan's only victim, that other families might be waiting for answers about their missing daughters, added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating case. Serial predators often operate for years before being caught, leaving trails of victims whose disappearances remain officially unsolved even when investigators know exactly who's responsible. Natalie's mother became an advocate for families of missing persons, particularly in cases where bodies hadn't been found. She worked to change laws making it easier to prosecute murders without remains, arguing that killers shouldn't benefit from successfully hiding evidence. Her advocacy led to legislation in several states, reforms named after Natalie that expanded prosecutors' ability to bring charges in bodiless murder cases. It's painful work, channeling grief into legal reform, but it gives meaning to loss that would otherwise feel completely pointless. If Natalie's case helps convict even one other killer who thought hiding a body would let them escape justice, then perhaps there's some small redemption in the tragedy. The pattern we've been tracking through these cases, jealousy, control, obsession, systemic failure, takes a different form in our next story. This involves not a crime of passion or domestic violence, but something more calculated, more unusual, and deeply disturbing in its own way. Academic environments are supposed to be places of learning and growth, but they can also breed intense competition and resentment that occasionally crosses into criminal territory. Lin Xiaomei was 20 years old, a junior at a prestigious university in Eastern Asia, studying chemistry with a focus that impressed her professors and intimidated her peers. She was consistently ranked at the top of her class, earning perfect scores on exams that challenged everyone else, completing research projects that demonstrated a level of understanding beyond her years. Success like that attracts attention, and not all of it is positive. Lin's dormitory roommate, whose name was withheld from public records due to the legal complexities of the case, was also studying chemistry. But where Lin excelled, the roommate struggled. Where Lin's assignments were always perfect, the roommates were merely adequate. The comparison was constant and demoralizing. The living arrangement forced them into close proximity, sharing a small room where academic performance couldn't be ignored or escaped. The roommate watched Lynn study with seemingly effortless comprehension while she herself struggled to grasp concepts that came naturally to Lynn. The resentment grew slowly, feeding on daily reminders of the gap between their abilities. Lynn, for her part, seemed oblivious to the tension. She was kind to her roommate, offering help with difficult concepts, sharing study materials, trying to be supportive. But that kindness might have made things worse, adding patronization to the roommate's sense of inadequacy. Every offered explanation of a complex topic was another reminder that Lynn understood things the roommate didn't. The first indication something was wrong came in late spring when Lynn started experiencing unusual symptoms. Fatigue at first, then nausea, then stomach pains that grew progressively worse. She went to the campus health center, where doctors ran basic tests and diagnosed stress-induced gastritis, common among students during exam periods. They prescribed medication and suggested she rest more. But the symptoms didn't improve. They worsened. Lynn started having episodes of severe abdominal pain that left her curled up in bed, unable to attend classes. Her hair began falling out in clumps. Her skin took on an unhealthy pallor. The campus health center referred her to a hospital for more comprehensive testing. Doctors were puzzled. Lynn's symptoms didn't fit any obvious diagnosis. They tested for common illnesses, rare diseases, anything that might explain her deteriorating condition. Blood work showed elevated levels of certain metals, but the numbers weren't conclusive enough to point to a specific cause. Meanwhile, Lynn's academic performance was suffering. She'd missed too many classes, fallen behind on assignments, couldn't concentrate through the pain and fatigue. For someone who'd always been at the top of her class, this decline was emotionally devastating on top of the physical suffering. Her roommate, interestingly, showed what seemed like genuine concern. She brought Lynn food when she was too sick to go to the dining hall. She took notes in classes Lynn missed and shared them. She appeared to be a supportive friend dealing with her roommate's mysterious illness. The truth was far darker. The roommate had been poisoning Lynn for months, adding small amounts of thallium to her food and drinks. Thallium is a toxic metal that causes exactly the kind of progressive symptoms Lynn was experiencing. Symptoms that can be difficult to diagnose because thallium poisoning is relatively rare in modern times. The roommate had access to thallium through the chemistry lab, where they both worked on research projects. She'd been carefully stealing minute quantities, amounts small enough that inventory controls didn't flag the discrepancy. She'd researched the symptoms and timeline of thallium poisoning, understanding that gradual exposure would be harder to diagnose than acute poisoning. Her motive was disturbingly simple. If Lynn couldn't perform academically, the gap between them would narrow. If Lynn was too sick to attend classes or complete assignments, the roommate's own mediocre performance would look better by comparison. It was academic competition taken to a psychopathic extreme, a decision to destroy someone rather than improve herself. The diagnosis of thallium poisoning finally came after Lynn's condition deteriorated to the point where she was hospitalized with neurological symptoms. A toxicologist reviewed her case and recognized the pattern. Blood tests confirmed elevated thallium levels consistent with chronic poisoning. The question then became, how was Lynn being exposed? The investigation focused on her environment, testing her dorm room for contamination. They found trace amounts of thallium in her water bottle, in containers where she kept snacks, in items that only she used. The contamination was deliberate and targeted, not environmental exposure. Suspicion immediately fell on the roommate, who had the knowledge, access to thallium, an opportunity to contaminate Lynn's belongings. Police searched the roommate's possessions and found thallium hidden in her desk drawer, carefully stored in a container labeled as something innocuous. They also found searches on her computer about thallium poisoning symptoms and whether it could be detected in autopsies. When confronted with this evidence, the roommate broke down and confessed. She admitted to poisoning Lynn over a period of 5 months, adding thallium to anything she thought Lynn would consume. She claimed she hadn't meant to cause permanent damage, just wanted Lynn to be sick enough to miss exams and fall behind academically. But thallium poisoning causes cumulative damage that can be irreversible. Even though Lynn survived thanks to medical intervention that chelated the metal from her system, she suffered permanent neurological effects. Her hair grew back, her acute symptoms resolved, but she was left with tremors and difficulty with fine motor control, permanent reminders of what her roommate had done. The roommate was arrested and charged with attempted murder. Her defense attorney tried to argue that she hadn't intended to kill Lynn, just make her sick, but the prosecution pointed out that poisoning someone over 5 months demonstrated a sustained intent to cause harm, regardless of whether she fully understood or cared about the potential lethality of her actions. The case became international news, highlighting the intense academic pressures in competitive university environments and the dangerous extremes to which some students might go. Universities across the region reviewed their lab security protocols, implementing stricter controls on toxic substances and better inventory tracking. The roommate was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison, but she served less than 2 years before her family, who had significant wealth and connections, arranged for her to leave the country. She fled to a nation without an extradition treaty, effectively escaping the remainder of her sentence. This outcome devastated Lynn and her family. Not only had she been permanently injured by someone she'd trusted, but that person had escaped full accountability through privilege and corruption. The injustice compounded the trauma, adding anger to the grief of what she'd lost. Lynn attempted to continue her studies, but found that her neurological damage made the precision work required in chemistry too difficult. She changed majors, graduated eventually in a different field, and now works in science education rather than research. She's carved out a meaningful life despite what happened, but it's not the life she'd planned, not the future her abilities should have led to. The case represents a particular kind of violence, calculated and cold, motivated not by passion or loss of control, but by jealousy and competition taken to criminal extremes. The roommate made a choice every single day for 5 months to poison Lynn, had countless opportunities to stop, to recognize the horror of what she was doing, and chose instead to continue. That sustained intentionality makes it harder to process than crimes of passion. We can understand, even if we don't excuse, someone acting violently in a moment of rage or fear. But poisoning someone gradually over months requires a level of deliberate malice that feels almost incomprehensible. If you've made it this far through these stories, you might be feeling overwhelmed. The accumulation of tragedy, the repetition of patterns where warning signs were ignored and violence was preventable, can be emotionally exhausting. But staying engaged with these difficult stories is important. Looking away doesn't make the violence stop. It just means we're not learning from it. So if you're still with me, take a moment now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling me which case affected you most deeply, or share your thoughts on how we might better protect potential victims. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people, and awareness is the first step toward change. Our final case takes us back to domestic violence, but with a twist that demonstrates how people can hide entire lives from those closest to them, how the person sleeping next to you might be someone you don't know at all. Claire Whitman seemed like an ordinary suburban mother, living in a mountain state, raising her 2 children, existing in the comfortable routine of middle-class American life. She was 42 when she disappeared, last seen dropping her kids at school on a Tuesday morning. She waved goodbye, told them she'd see them that afternoon, and drove away. When 3 o'clock came and Claire didn't show up for pickup, the school called her emergency contacts. No one had heard from her. Her car was found abandoned at a trailhead 15 miles from town. The investigation into Claire's disappearance initially focused on the obvious suspects: her husband, her friends, anyone who might have had reason to harm her. But what they discovered was that Claire had been living a double life so completely that even her family hadn't suspected. Claire had a secret source of income that she'd been hiding for over 3 years. She'd been working as an escort, advertising online, meeting clients at hotels in neighboring cities. She'd kept this completely separate from her family life, using a burner phone, creating a fake name and persona, carefully compartmentalizing the 2 worlds. The money she earned went into a secret bank account. She wasn't doing it out of financial necessity. Her husband made a decent living and they weren't struggling. The motivation seemed to be something else, perhaps a desire for independence, for a life outside the confines of suburban motherhood, for excitement or validation that her regular life didn't provide. But working as an escort carried obvious risks. particularly when meeting strangers in isolated locations. Claire had been careful, vetting clients, insisting on meeting in public first, trusting her instincts about who felt dangerous. But eventually, she met someone whose danger wasn't apparent until it was too late. Investigators discovered Claire's secret life through her computer, finding the escort ads and email communications with clients. They reached out to men she'd been in contact with, interviewing each one, trying to determine who'd seen her last. Most cooperated, providing alibis and information. But one name kept appearing in Claire's communications without a corresponding person they could locate. The man used the name Michael in his emails, but it was clearly fake. He'd paid in cash, used a burner phone, taken precautions to remain anonymous. He'd met Claire 3 times over the previous month, and they'd scheduled a meeting for the Tuesday morning she disappeared. Investigators worked to trace Michael through whatever digital breadcrumbs he'd left. They found that he'd used public Wi-Fi networks for his email communications, making tracking difficult but not impossible. They identified several locations he'd accessed the internet from, building a geographic profile. That profile led them to Kenneth Marsh, a man with a violent criminal history who'd been released from prison 2 years earlier after serving time for assault. Kenneth had been living in a rooming house near several of the Wi-Fi locations Michael had used. When police showed Kenneth photos of Claire, he claimed not to recognize her. But his story fell apart quickly. His DNA was found in Claire's car, which he couldn't explain. His credit card showed charges at a gas station near the trailhead where Claire's car was found, on the morning she disappeared. And when police searched his room, they found Claire's jewelry hidden in his closet. Confronted with this evidence, Kenneth admitted to meeting Claire, but claimed she'd left alive after their encounter. He said he didn't know what happened to her after that, but the forensic evidence told a different story. Luminol testing in Kenneth's vehicle revealed blood evidence that had been cleaned but not completely removed. The blood was Claire's. Without Claire's body, prosecutors faced challenges similar to those in Natalie Brooks' case. But they had more direct evidence linking Kenneth to Claire at the time of her disappearance, and they had the blood evidence suggesting violence. They charged him with murder. The trial revealed uncomfortable details about Claire's secret life, information that her family had to hear in public testimony. Her husband testified that he'd had no idea about the escort work, that he was shocked and hurt to learn about it. Her children, teenagers by then, had to process not only their mother's death but the revelation that she'd been living a completely hidden existence. The defense tried to argue that Claire's lifestyle put her in contact with dangerous people, that someone other than Kenneth could have killed her. They tried to create reasonable doubt by emphasizing the absence of a body and the possibility that Claire had simply run away to escape her double life. But the prosecution methodically built their case. Kenneth had a history of violence against women. He'd lied about knowing Claire. His DNA and credit card placed him at key locations. Her blood was in his car. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The jury convicted Kenneth Marsh of second-degree murder, finding that while the killing was intentional, it hadn't been premeditated. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Claire's body was never found. Kenneth has never revealed what he did with her, maintaining that she left alive, and he doesn't know what happened after that. It's a lie everyone knows is a lie. But without cooperation from him, Claire's family has been denied even the closure of laying her to rest. The case left her children in a particularly difficult position. They'd lost their mother to violence, but they'd also lost the version of their mother they'd thought they knew. The revelation of her secret life complicated their grief, adding confusion and anger to the sadness of her death. Her husband struggled similarly, trying to reconcile 15 years of marriage with the discovery that Claire had been keeping massive secrets. He blamed himself for not noticing, for not being whatever it was Claire needed that drove her to seek something outside their marriage. The psychological complexity of grieving someone while simultaneously learning they weren't who you thought they were is a unique kind of torture. Claire's case raises difficult questions about judgment and victimhood. Some people responded to news of her double life by suggesting she'd put herself in danger, that her choices had led to her death. But this victim blaming ignores the fundamental fact that Kenneth Marsh chose to kill her. Whatever Claire was doing, however risky her choices, she didn't deserve to be murdered. The tendency to judge victims, to look for ways they contributed to their own victimization, is a pernicious form of victim blaming that happens particularly often in cases involving sex work or perceived moral transgressions. It allows people to distance themselves from the victim, to convince themselves that if they make better choices, they'll be safe, when the reality is that violence is always the perpetrator's choice and responsibility. Claire Whitman was a complex person living a complicated life. She made choices that her family didn't know about and might not have approved of. But she was still a person deserving of safety, still a mother who loved her children, still someone whose life had value beyond the secrets she kept. We've now walked through 9 cases, 9 lives interrupted or ended by violence that followed predictable patterns. Isabella Cruz Navarro, trusting the wrong person at a nightclub. Emily Rowe, trying to escape an abusive marriage. Hannah Cole, walking home from a bar. Lucia Moreno, dating an older boyfriend. Thomas Reed, manipulated into becoming a murder victim by his own wife. Rachel Turner, fighting for custody of her daughter. Natalie Brooks, finishing a night shift. Lynn Xiaomei, excelling in her studies. Claire Whitman, hiding a double life. Different circumstances, different details, but united by common threads. Jealousy, control, obsession, and institutional failures to protect people who were showing or experiencing warning signs. These weren't mysterious crimes. They were preventable tragedies. The final minutes of this documentary need to address what we do with this information, how we move from witnessing these stories to learning from them, how we transform the anger and sadness they provoke into something productive. First, we need to acknowledge that violence against women, while not exclusive, is overwhelmingly common. The statistics are staggering. 1 in 4 women will experience severe physical violence from an intimate partner. Domestic violence is one of the leading causes of death for women worldwide. These aren't isolated incidents. They're epidemic. Second, we need to recognize warning signs without falling into the trap of victim blaming. Extreme jealousy is a warning sign. Isolating someone from friends and family is a warning sign. Escalating control over another person's behavior, finances, or choices is a warning sign. But recognizing these signs doesn't mean victims are responsible for not heeding them. Abusers are experts at manipulation, at making control feel like love, at convincing victims that the problem is them, not the abuser. Third, we need to demand better from institutions designed to protect people. Police departments need to take domestic violence seriously from the first report, not wait until someone is dead to mobilize resources. Restraining orders need enforcement mechanisms that actually keep victims safe. Courts need to recognize patterns of abuse and act accordingly in custody and divorce proceedings. Fourth, we need to support victims trying to leave dangerous situations. Leaving is the most dangerous time, when abusers feel control slipping and become most violent. Victims need safe places to go, financial resources to rebuild their lives, legal support to navigate complex systems. These resources are chronically underfunded, forcing people to choose between staying in dangerous situations or facing homelessness and poverty. Fifth, we need to examine how we talk about these cases, the language we use, the narratives we construct. When we ask what a victim was doing in a certain location, or why they didn't leave sooner, or why they trusted the wrong person, we're subtly shifting responsibility from perpetrator to victim. The question should always be, why did the perpetrator choose violence? What in our society enables and excuses that choice? Sixth, we need to teach young people about healthy relationships, about consent, about recognizing manipulation and control. These shouldn't be lessons learned through trauma. They should be foundational education, as basic as reading and math. We need to give young people tools to recognize danger before they're in it, language to name what they're experiencing, resources to seek help. Seventh, we need to hold media accountable for how they cover these cases. The tendency to sensationalize, to focus on salacious details, to treat real tragedies as entertainment, does disservice to victims and families. Coverage should be respectful, focusing on patterns and prevention rather than just the shocking details that drive clicks and views. Eighth, we need to support research into violence prevention. We need data on what interventions work, what warning signs are most predictive, what resources most effectively help victims escape dangerous situations. We need to approach this as a public health crisis requiring evidence-based solutions, not just individual tragedies that we process emotionally and then forget. Ninth, we need to address the root causes. Toxic masculinity that teaches men they're entitled to control women, economic systems that make leaving dangerous situations financially impossible, cultural narratives that romanticize jealousy and possessiveness, legal frameworks that treat domestic violence as less serious than violence between strangers. And 10th, we need to remember the human beings at the center of these stories. Isabella, Emily, Hannah, Lucia, Thomas, Rachel, Natalie, Lynn, Claire. They weren't just victims. They were people with dreams and fears and daily routines and favorite foods and inside jokes with friends. They were real, and their deaths diminished the world in ways that extend far beyond the immediate circle of people who loved them. Each of these deaths left ripples. Children growing up without parents. Parents burying children. Siblings, friends, colleagues, neighbors, all touched by loss and trauma. The toll extends beyond the count of bodies, encompassing all the futures that were stolen, all the potential that will never be realized. Isabella never finished her environmental science degree, never conducted research that might have contributed to solving climate challenges, never had the children she'd wanted, never grew old with someone who actually loved her rather than destroyed her. That loss is incalculable, both to her personally and to the world that would have benefited from her contributions. Emily never got to see her children graduate high school, never walked her daughters down the aisle at their weddings, never became the grandmother she would have been. Her children lost not just their mother, but all the future moments she should have been present for, all the guidance and support she would have provided as they navigated adulthood. Hannah never got to build the career she'd been preparing for, never married, never traveled to the places she'd dreamed about visiting. Her potential was extinguished at 22. Before she'd even fully begun the life she was supposed to live. Lucia never got to graduate high school, never went to college, never became whatever she might have been if she'd been protected from a predatory older boyfriend. She was 16, still a child really, with her entire life ahead of her. Thomas never got to see his daughters grow up, never retired from the job he'd worked at for decades, never got to be the grandfather his grandchildren will now never know. His death robbed not just him, but future generations of his presence and love. Rachel never got to raise her daughter through adolescence, never helped her navigate first relationships and college applications and all the milestones of growing up. Emma had to face those moments without her mother, guided by an aunt who loved her but couldn't fully replace what she'd lost. Natalie never became a nurse practitioner, never helped the patients she'd been working towards serving, never found the relationship she'd been hoping for after being single most of her 20s. Her dedication to helping others ended with her being helped too late to save her. Lynn never completed her chemistry research, never made the discoveries she might have made, never mentored students who would have benefited from her brilliance. Her academic future was stolen by jealousy, so petty it would be laughable if it wasn't so tragic. Claire never got to see her children become adults, never explained her choices to them when they were old enough to possibly understand, never resolved the contradiction between her suburban mother identity and her secret life. Her story ended with mysteries that will haunt her family forever. These weren't just victims. They were people, and we owe it to them to learn from their deaths, to recognize the patterns, to do better at protecting the people still alive who might be in similar situations. Some of you watching this might see yourselves in these stories, might recognize the warning signs in your own relationships or the relationships of people you care about. If that's you, please hear this. You deserve to be safe. You deserve relationships built on respect, not control. You deserve partners who celebrate your independence rather than punishing it. Leaving isn't easy. The statistics show that victims leave abusive relationships an average of 7 times before they leave permanently. Each attempt is brave, even when it doesn't stick. Each attempt is progress, even when you end up going back. The fact that leaving is hard doesn't mean you're weak or complicit in your own abuse. It means the systems that should support you are inadequate, and the person hurting you is skilled at manipulation. If you're in danger, reach out to domestic violence organizations in your area. They can help you create safety plans, connect you with resources, provide support as you navigate leaving. You don't have to have a plan to reach out. You don't have to be ready to leave immediately. Just making contact, just hearing that you deserve better, can be the first step. If you know someone in an abusive relationship, your role is to believe them. to support them without judgment, to be there when they're ready to leave even if that takes multiple attempts. Don't give ultimatums. Don't criticize them for staying. Don't make them feel like they have to justify their choices. Just be consistent, be available, be supportive. For those of you who don't see yourselves in these stories, who aren't in danger and don't know anyone who is, your role is to demand better from institutions and to challenge cultural narratives that enable violence. Vote for politicians who support domestic violence services funding. Push back when you hear people make excuses for controlling behavior or blame victims for not leaving. Support organizations doing prevention work and helping survivors rebuild their lives. We all have roles to play in changing the culture that allows violence like this to continue. It's not enough to condemn individual perpetrators while ignoring the systems and attitudes that enable them. We need comprehensive change, from education to policy to cultural norms to legal frameworks. The 9 cases we've examined today are just 9 among thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions when you expand the view globally. Each one is a tragedy. Each one matters. And each one teaches lessons we need to learn if we're going to prevent the next one. Before we close, take a moment to engage with this video. Like it, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment about what resonated with you or what changes you think would make a difference. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people, and awareness is crucial to creating change. These weren't mysteries. They were signals, warnings, preventable tragedies that happened because people with power to intervene either didn't or couldn't or wouldn't. We can do better. We have to do better. The alternative is continuing to count bodies and wondering why nothing ever changes. The families of these victims have shown incredible courage in allowing their stories to be told, in hoping that public awareness might prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. They've transformed their private grief into public advocacy, spending years fighting for justice and policy changes. Isabella's mother established that scholarship fund and speaks at universities about the warning signs she wishes she'd recognized sooner. Emily's oldest daughter volunteers at domestic violence shelters, channeling her trauma into helping other women escape situations like her mother's. Henna's family pushed for police reforms that have changed how missing person cases are handled in their jurisdiction. Rachel's sister raises Emma while advocating for better protection of victims involved in contentious divorces. Natalie's mother worked to change laws around prosecuting murders without bodies. Lynn continues to speak about the competitive pressures that can drive students to unethical and criminal acts. Claire's family has had to navigate their advocacy carefully, honoring her memory while acknowledging the complexity of her choices. These families could have retreated into private grief, could have avoided the public scrutiny that comes with keeping these cases in the news. But they chose instead to speak out, to push for changes, to ensure that their loved ones' deaths might prevent future deaths. That courage deserves recognition and support. As we conclude, let's revisit the central question posed at the beginning. How many of these tragedies could have been prevented? The honest answer is, probably all of them. If Isabella's friends had been more insistent about not letting her leave with a stranger. If Emily's restraining order had been enforced with electronic monitoring. If Hannah's case had been taken seriously from day one with proper search protocols. If Lucia's parents had been able to legally intervene in her relationship with an adult man. If Thomas's friends had recognized the signs of Rebecca's manipulation. If Rachel had had access to better protection during her divorce. If Natalie had been warned about Evan Porter before he could target her. If Lynn's roommate had received mental health support for her competitive anxiety. If Claire had felt able to be honest about her needs rather than living a secret life. These aren't fantasy scenarios. These are reasonable interventions that, in a better system with better awareness and better resources, might have happened. The fact that they didn't represent failures at individual, institutional, and societal levels. But recognizing failure is only useful if it drives change. We can't bring back the people we've lost, but we can honor their memories by doing better for the people still alive, still at risk, still navigating situations that might escalate to violence if no one intervenes. The patterns we've seen aren't random. They're predictable, which means they're also preventable. Jealousy that escalates to stalking. Control that increases to violence. Obsession that ends in murder. These progressions follow paths we can map and interrupt if we're paying attention and willing to act. The institutional failures aren't inevitable. They're the result of underfunding, inadequate training, cultural biases, and systemic prioritization of efficiency over thoroughness. Police departments can be trained better. Courts can implement better protocols. Social services can be funded adequately. These are choices we make as a society, and we can make different choices. The cultural narratives that romanticize jealousy and possession aren't unchangeable. We created these narratives, and we can create better ones. We can teach that healthy love respects independence. We can model relationships built on trust rather than control. We can stop excusing toxic behavior as passion and start recognizing it as abuse. Change is possible. It's not easy. It requires sustained effort and resources and political will. It requires believing that women's lives matter enough to invest in their safety. It requires recognizing that violence is a public health crisis deserving of serious intervention, not just a private matter to be handled behind closed doors. Some people hearing these stories will feel overwhelmed, will wonder what difference one person can make against such massive problems. But change happens through accumulation of individual actions. One person speaking up about warning signs. One person donating to a domestic violence shelter. One person voting for politicians who support survivors. One person teaching their children about healthy relationships. One person refusing to excuse controlling behavior as romantic. These individual actions aggregate into cultural shifts, into policy changes, into lives saved. You don't have to solve the entire problem yourself. You just have to do your part, whatever that looks like in your specific context and capacity. For some, that means direct service work, volunteering at shelters or hotlines, providing immediate help to people in crisis. For others, it means advocacy work, pushing for legislative changes, demanding better from institutions, keeping pressure on systems to improve. For others, it means education work, teaching young people, challenging narratives, creating awareness in your communities. All of these roles matter. All of these contributions make a difference. The key is not to let the scale of the problem paralyze you into inaction. Start somewhere. Do something. Be part of the solution rather than passively accepting the problem. As we prepare to close this documentary, let's spend a moment in silence thinking about the people we've discussed today. Not just as victims, not just as case studies, but as human beings who deserved better than the violence they experienced. Think about Isabella's smile in those last photos before she met Marco, the joy of being young and free and full of possibility. Think about Emily trying desperately to protect her children while navigating an impossible situation. Think about Hannah walking home from a night out with friends, doing something millions of people do safely, but that for her ended in tragedy. Think about Lucia at 16, still figuring out who she was, trusting someone who exploited rather than valued that trust. Think about Thomas working on his car in his own garage, completely unaware that his wife had orchestrated his murder. Think about Rachel fighting for her daughter, trying to escape a marriage that had become warfare. Think about Natalie finishing her shift as a nurse, probably tired, looking forward to going home and sleeping, never suspecting she was being watched by someone planning to take her. Think about Lynn excelling in her studies, probably dreaming about her research career, not realizing her roommate was poisoning her out of jealousy. Think about Claire living her complicated double life. Whatever motivated those choices, trying to balance multiple identities, meeting the wrong person on the wrong day. These were real people with complex inner lives, with hopes and fears and daily routines. Their deaths diminished the world in concrete, measurable ways that extend far beyond the immediate circle of people who loved them. And think about the people who killed them. Marco, Lena, and Rosa in that apartment letting jealousy turn into group violence. Daniel Rose strangling his wife because she dared to leave. Trevor Morrison attacking a woman walking home. Diego Salvat, still at large, having stolen a teenage girl's life. Rebecca Reed manipulating a lonely man into becoming a murderer. Daniel Turner staging an elaborate crime scene to hide his wife's murder. Evan Porter stalking and killing multiple women. Lynn's roommate poisoning her competitor. Kenneth Marsh killing an escort and hiding her body. These weren't monsters from horror movies. They were ordinary people who made choices, who had opportunities to stop and chose to continue, who prioritized their own desires and emotions over other people's lives. Understanding that ordinariness is important because it means the danger isn't always obvious. The person who will kill you might seem nice at first. The relationship that will become abusive might start out feeling like love. That's not meant to create paranoia or fear. It's meant to create awareness, to help you recognize the warning signs before you're too invested to see them clearly. Extreme jealousy isn't romantic. Isolation isn't protection. Control isn't care. These are red flags, and recognizing them early can save your life. If this documentary has affected you, if you're feeling overwhelmed by the accumulation of tragedy, that's normal. These are difficult stories. They're supposed to be difficult. The alternative is becoming numb to violence, treating these deaths as statistics rather than human losses. Stay engaged. Stay angry. Channel those feelings into action rather than letting them foster into despair. The world needs people who care enough to be disturbed by violence, who refuse to accept it as inevitable, who believe we can and must do better. Remember that while these 9 cases ended in tragedy, countless others don't. People leave abusive relationships successfully every day. Potential victims escape dangerous situations because they or someone around them recognized warning signs. Investigations are handled competently, leading to justice. Systems work as they're supposed to, protecting people who need protection. The negative cases get more attention because tragedy is more compelling than near misses and successful interventions. But the successes happen constantly. They just don't make headlines. For every Emily Rowe who died despite getting a restraining order, there are women whose restraining orders did protect them, who rebuilt their lives safely because systems worked. For every Hannah Cole whose case was mishandled, there are missing persons found quickly because investigators followed proper protocols. For every Lucia Moreno whose warnings were dismissed, there are teenagers protected from predatory relationships by adults who intervened effectively. The point isn't to minimize the failures we've examined or to suggest everything is fine. The point is to maintain hope that change is possible, that we're not fighting an unwinnable battle. We can prevent violence. We can protect people. We can do better. The evidence is all around us in the cases that don't end in tragedy, in the lives saved by intervention, in the people who leave dangerous situations and go on to live full, safe lives. You might be one of those people. You might be someone who left and is now safe. You might be someone who recognized danger and got out before it escalated. You might be someone who helped a friend escape, who spoke up about warning signs, who made a difference in someone else's story. If that's you, know that your courage matters, that your actions rippled outward in ways you might never fully know, that you've contributed to making the world a little safer. As we close this documentary, let's acknowledge that some questions remain unanswered. Diego Salvat still hasn't been found, and Lucia's fate remains officially unknown. Evan Porter never revealed where he put Natalie's body, denying her family closure. Kenneth Marsh maintains his lie about Claire, leaving her family without even the ability to bury her remains. These unresolved elements are frustrating. We want neat endings, clear answers, justice that feels complete. But real life often doesn't provide that. Sometimes the bad guys get away. Sometimes families never get answers. Sometimes justice is partial or delayed or denied entirely. That frustration should fuel continued advocacy rather than resignation. Diego Salvat is still out there, possibly still dangerous. The investigation continues, and he may yet be found. Evan Porter may eventually reveal what he did with Natalie's body, particularly if doing so offers him some benefit or eases his conscience. Kenneth Marsh may someday tell the truth about Claire's final resting place. Stranger things have happened. Cold cases are solved decades later. Fugitives are found after years on the run. Killers confess to bringing peace to families. Hope persists even in the face of long odds, because what's the alternative? Giving up means accepting that some people will never get justice, never get answers, never get closure. That acceptance feels like betrayal of the victims and their families. So we keep pushing. We keep investigating. We keep demanding better from systems designed to protect people. We keep raising awareness about warning signs and patterns. We keep supporting organizations that help survivors and advocate for victims. We keep teaching young people about healthy relationships and consent. We keep voting for policies that prioritize safety over convenience or cost saving. All of this work is exhausting. It would be easier to look away, to let these stories wash over us without truly engaging, to convince ourselves that violence only happens to other people in other places. But that comfort would come at the cost of our humanity, our ability to care about suffering beyond our immediate circle, our sense of shared responsibility for creating a safer world. The 9 people we've discussed today didn't have the option to look away from their situations. They lived these stories, experienced this violence, lost their lives or their futures to people who chose cruelty over compassion. The least we can do is witness their stories without flinching, honor their memories by learning from their deaths, and commit to doing better for the people still alive who might be in similar danger. I want to thank you for staying with me through these difficult hours, for engaging with stories that many people would prefer to ignore, for caring enough to listen all the way through. Your attention matters. Your willingness to be disturbed by violence rather than numbing yourself to it matters. Your commitment to being part of the solution rather than passively accepting the problem matters. Before you go, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment sharing which case affected you most deeply or what changes you think would make the biggest difference in preventing future tragedies. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people, and awareness is the essential first step toward creating change. Share this documentary with people in your life who need to hear these messages, whether they're in dangerous situations themselves or they're in positions to help others. The more people who understand the patterns of violence, who recognize warning signs, who know resources are available, the more lives we can save. Support organizations doing this work. Donate if you can afford to. Volunteer if you have time. Advocate for funding and policy changes. Attend vigils and rallies. Keep pressure on institutions to do better. Vote for candidates who prioritize survivors' safety. Every action, no matter how small it might seem, contributes to broader change. Most importantly, believe survivors when they tell you they're in danger. Don't wait for proof. Don't require them to justify their fear. Don't minimize their concerns or suggest they're overreacting. Believe them and help them access resources to get safe. Your belief might be the thing that saves their life. We started this documentary by asking how many of these tragedies could have been prevented. We've examined 9 cases where warning signs were present, where interventions might have made a difference, where systems failed at critical moments. The answer remains, probably all of them. These weren't mysterious acts of random violence. They were preventable tragedies. Isabella didn't have to die in that apartment. Emily didn't have to be strangled on her sister's lawn. Hannah didn't have to be abducted from a rest stop. Lucia didn't have to disappear at 16. Thomas didn't have to be shot in his own garage. Rachel didn't have to be buried on her ex-husband's family property. Natalie didn't have to be taken after her shift. Lynn didn't have to be poisoned by her roommate. Claire didn't have to meet a violent end at the hands of a man who saw her as disposable. Every single one of these deaths represents a failure, a moment when intervention was possible but didn't happen, a warning sign that was visible but ignored. We can't change what happened to them, but we can learn from their stories. We can recognize the patterns. We can demand better from our institutions. We can support people in dangerous situations. We can teach the next generation to recognize and reject violence. These 9 people didn't die so that we could learn from them. They died because people who should have protected them failed to do so. But now that they're gone, the least we can do is ensure their deaths weren't completely meaningless, that their stories contribute to preventing future tragedies, that their names are remembered not just as victims, but as catalysts for change. Isabella Cruz Navarro, Emily Rowe, Hannah Cole, Lucia Moreno, Thomas Reed, Rachel Turner, Natalie Brooks, Lynn Chalmé, Claire Whitman. Say their names. Remember their stories. Learn from their deaths. Do better for the people still alive. These weren't mysteries. They were signals, warnings written in blood that we ignored until it was too late. The question now is whether we'll keep ignoring the warnings, or whether we'll finally start listening, finally start acting, finally start creating the world where these tragedies don't happen, because we're protecting people before violence occurs rather than mourning them after. The choice is ours. The responsibility is ours. The future is ours to shape. Let's make it one where stories like these become historical relics rather than ongoing patterns, where violence is treated as the public health crisis it is, where every person has access to safety and support, where warning signs are heeded rather than dismissed. That's the world these 9 people deserve to live in. It's the world their families deserve to keep them in. It's the world we owe to everyone still at risk, still in danger, still hoping that someone will notice and help before it's too late. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being willing to engage with difficult truths rather than comfortable lies. Now go out and do something with what you've learned. Make a difference in whatever way you can. Be part of the solution. Change the world, one intervention at a time, one supported survivor at a time, one prevented tragedy at a time. The work continues. The fight continues. The hope continues. And as long as people like you are willing to stay engaged, to keep caring, to keep pushing for change, there's reason to believe we can do better. We must do better. The alternative is unacceptable. Remember, these weren't mysteries. They were preventable. And the next tragedy, the one that hasn't happened yet, the one that's building momentum somewhere right now with someone missing warning signs or ignoring red flags or hoping things will get better on their own, that one is still preventable too. If you're that person, if you're in danger or know someone who is, please reach out. Please get help. Please don't become another story in another documentary about preventable violence. You deserve better. You deserve safety. You deserve life. And to everyone else, stay vigilant. Stay compassionate. Stay committed to creating change. These stories matter. These lives mattered. And what we do next, how we respond to these tragedies, whether we learn and grow and improve, or whether we forget and repeat the same patterns, that will determine whether we're honoring their memories or betraying them. Choose honor. Choose action. Choose change. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and stay committed to making the world a place where documentaries like this one become unnecessary, because we've finally learned to protect people before they need to be mourned. This has been Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. Thank you for watching.